Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this special meeting of the City Council and the Board of Public Utilities. This is our study session for March 27th. We will start with the roll call. Ms. Gomez.
Let the record show that all council members are present and all board members of the Board of Public Utilities, with the exception of Board Member Badenford.
Thank you very much. And we'll go to public comment on items that are not on today's agenda. Do you have any cards for that, Ms. Gomez? Okay, thank you. And so we'll begin our study session with item 3.1. Ms. Hurtado.
Thank you, Mayor. Item 3.1, the Santa Rosa Plain Groundwater Sustainability Agency funding options, and Jennifer Burke, our Deputy Director for Water, will present.
Good afternoon, Mayor Corsi and members of the council. Good afternoon, Chairman Galvin and members of the board. Here today to give a very brief overview of the Santa Rosa Plain Groundwater Sustainability Agency and the funding options that are being considered to fund the GSA in the coming years. So I'll give a little bit of background on Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, or SGMA, as well as the current GSA funding options that the GSA board is considering. And then we're really looking to get any feedback either from the board or the council, or should there be any from the public. So as the board and council may recall from previous presentations, as we were developing the GSA, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act came into law in January of 2015, and required that groundwater sustainability agencies be formed by June of last year, which we did in this basin. SGMA does apply to 3 basins in Sonoma County. Santa Rosa Plain is the basin that the city of Santa Rosa pretty much overlies. And in addition to requiring that a GSA be developed, SGMA also requires that a groundwater sustainability plan be developed by January of 2022, and that we achieve sustainability in the groundwater basin by 2042. SGMA also gave GSA boards the right to assess rates and fees to fund the activities for the GSA. Just as a reminder, this is the watershed outline, and the Santa Rosa Plain Groundwater Basin is within that. This shows you the breakdown of how many wells are in the groundwater basin, and the breakdown is pretty much 50% of the wells are rural domestic, 32% are agricultural, and about roughly 18% is used by municipal governments or municipal water suppliers. Here's a reminder regarding the funding. So as we were developing the GSA, in particular for the Santa Rosa Plain, all of the member agencies agreed to fund the first 2 years of the GSA, with the thought that there was the possibility the member agencies could get paid back over time. So that is still being considered. The first 2 years were split evenly among all of the member agencies, with the exception of the Sonoma Resource Conservation District, and that was by agreement because they were all in all 3 basins. We're definitely looking as much efficiencies as possible to keep the budget as low as possible, sharing resources among the 3 basins when needed, but there is funding that is needed to run the GSA as well as to start developing the GSP. In future years, the GSA board working with staff will be adopting budgets, but it's estimated it'll be approximately between $500,000 to $600,000 a year that's needed in the next after FY 2018, the next 3 years after that, to fund the development of the GSP as well as the GSA activities. So starting to look at what possible rates and fees could be, the GSA staff working with a rate consultant started looking at the metrics within the basin, trying to understand what could be possible things that we could look at for charging a fee or a rate. Here's some information about the metrics in the basin. At this point, there are a little over 4,100 known wells. We have an estimate of how much is pumped each year. We know how many parcels are taxed within the basin and how much acres are in the basin. So those are all different metrics that the rate consultant has looked at for potentially assessing fees. In terms of the funding options, all are preliminary, all are being explored, but they're really looking, the GSA board is looking to start getting some feedback on what options would be considered, in particular looking at what is reasonable and equitable if possible. So the things that are being looked at are regulatory fees, which could be something from a well registration fee to a usage fee. Also looking at potentially pumpage fees on groundwater use. Also looking at potential to do some kind of a tax, whether it's per parcel or per acre. If it is a tax, it would have to go out for a 2/3 vote of the public. And then last, if we cannot come to some agreement on how this is going to be funded, we also want to just make the public aware of what the state intervention fees would be, because they are considerably more than what is being considered by the GSA. So based on the work that the rate consultant, Raftelis, has done, these are the preliminary estimates of the cost ranges. Those are taking into account the preliminary estimated budget that I mentioned, that $500,000 to $600,000 a year roughly. It also is incorporating, at this point, we do know that the GSA has been recommended for a $1 million grant for the GSP development. We haven't officially received that yet, and who knows what could happen, but right now it's being recommended. So you'll see those ranges depend on whether or not we get the grant funding. In addition, there could be other things that could change these amounts over time, but this is what's initially being looked at. And so you'll see on a per well charge, it ranges from $100 to $170. On a per acre foot, you can see ranges from 14 to 23, or what that amount would be per 1,000 gallons. Plus you have a per parcel and a per acre charge. In addition to looking at these options, the board, the GSA board, and the staff are also open to any kind of combination of these charges, if that makes sense, rates or fees. And then to give everyone an overview of what the state fees are, you can see that these are significantly more expensive than what is being considered by the GSA board. If we can't come to an agreement on funding, if we can't develop the GSP, if for some reason that the state has to come in, these will be the fees that they would charge. So it really is in the best interest of the GSA to try and find a funding mechanism that works well for our local entities, for our local entity and our local communities. We also wanted to let the board know, and the board and the council, apologies, know that there was an initial community meeting that happened last week to get feedback from the public. There were about 175 folks who attended. And the GSA staff is currently working on compiling that input and feedback from all those who attended. In general, there were a lot of concerns ranging from equity to general sense of being unhappy that we have to comply with the SGMA, which really is out of our hands. In April, there will be an advisory committee meeting where there will be a thorough discussion of the fee options by the advisory committee, taking into account the information from the community meetings. There will be a GSA board meeting in April where they'll receive an update on the community meetings as well as the discussions that are happening by the advisory committee. And then in May, the advisory committee is currently supposed to be making a recommendation to the GSA board on the rate and or fee. And then in June, the GSA board would consider it. The reason for the fast timeline is that the initial goal was to look at using the tax roll as the mechanism for billing. And in order to do that, you need to have a determination of the fee or rate that you're going to charge by August of this year. And just as a reminder, For the Santa Rosa Plain GSA, Councilmember Schwedhelm is our current GSA board member, and Vice Mayor Rogers is the alternate. In addition, if there's additional information, you can go to the website, sonomacountygroundwater.org, and there's specific information for the Santa Rosa Plain. With that, happy to take any questions, any feedback on these possible options that are being explored.
Thank you, Ms. Burke. And just to be clear, you're not asking for any action from the board or the council today. This is an informational item only.
Correct. This is only an informational item to see if there's any initial feedback on these ranges. And as we mentioned, there's a number of meetings still to go through the GSA process. We wanted to provide this as information and really to see if there was any initial feedback of pursue this more or this doesn't seem like it's a viable option.
Okay, thank you. Before we go to public comment, I want to see if there's any questions from either the council or the board. I'd like to let's alternate the questions between the board and the council, and I'll start with Chair Galvin, and why don't you call on somebody on your board first?
Anybody from the Board of Public Utilities have any questions or comments? Yes, Board Member Watts.
On slide number 5, it explains the total commitment. Can you explain what the budget consists of for the $460,000 for the first year and the $532 for the second year?
Sure. There's a number of things that are part of the budget for the GSA. We need to have an administrator. All the GSA boards are Brown Act compliant, so making sure that we comply with Brown Act requirements for meetings, minutes, et cetera. There is a requirement for a plan manager. So you have to have a plan manager as we're developing the groundwater sustainability plan. There's technical advice, there's grant writing, there's outreach, as well as starting to do all the data gathering and development of the GSP. So there's a number of things that are involved. We also have an attorney because we need to have legal advice. We have insurance requirements as well as hiring the rate consultant to do this work because there really is going to be a nexus and fee study. We are doing everything we can, coordinating among the 3 basins to use as many of those different consultants and contracts as we can to create efficiencies. So this is a very lean budget.
Thank you.
And Mr. Rogers.
Thank you so much. I have a couple of questions. First of all, does the GSP need to be approved by any state entity?
Yes, so the GSP will need to go through a hearing process and be adopted by the GSA board, and then it will need to go to the Department of Water Resources at the state. There is very detailed specific requirements, it's about yay big, of what needs to be in the GSP, and they will be looking at those to see if the GSP meets those regulations and requirements.
Okay, so I obviously took note of where it said 4,116 known wells. And so if we have to have a GSP approved by the state, is there going to be any attempt to find unknown wells? And I know we have an estimate of how much we assume people are pulling, but without monitoring, how are we going to be able to ensure that this is actually a sustainable plan?
So those are all great questions and things that the GSA board and the staff are grappling with. These are the known wells right now. We do believe that there are probably quite a bit more wells than are actually registered and permitted. So some options that are being looked at are through the GSP, trying to develop what those requirements would be for getting to truly understand the true number of wells and having mechanisms for monitoring those in some fashion. In terms of pumpage, we do know that based on the USGS study that was done for this basin, using demand factors such as land use type and evapotranspiration and crop coefficient, we're able to make some estimates for those that aren't metered, and for those that are metered, we were able to access what data we could. So that does give us an estimate of how much annual usage is being used. We do know that the law does say if you are a de minimis user, meaning you use less than 2 acre-feet per year or roughly 1,175 gallons per day, we cannot meter those folks. So from that perspective, it most likely will be these demand factors to continue to estimate what their usage would be.
Okay. And are there any Prop 218 issues that we have to think about in terms of how we do the charge? For example, if we do it per parcel as opposed to per acre foot, would that be a violation of 218?
So yes, and I don't know if Molly wants to talk about this more, but so what is being looked at really is sort of a two-phased approach. This initial funding that is being looked at to potentially be under the constraints of Prop 26, and really looking more at a regulatory fee as opposed to looking at the amount of groundwater that's pumped. However, it's not off the table, but really that's what's being leaned towards more at this point in time. If we actually do a charge that would be based on usage, we would have to go through the Prop 218 noticing process. And so it would be the same process that any other entity would do that's setting water rates. And again, I also just want to reinforce that if we do go through the potential parcel tax avenue, whether it's based on parcels or acres, that would be a 2/3 vote. And that would probably take quite a bit more time to determine, get that on the ballot, as well as more resources that we don't necessarily have currently identified.
Okay, great, thank you.
Any other board member questions? Yes, Board Member Grable.
Yeah, I had a question specifically on groundwater recharge. If you have, and also just, I'd like to see more specific criteria of users, not just, ag, municipal, and domestic. I think it's important to remember that there are, for instance, in the ag community, there's some people with, a need for a lot more of their own water, but also with the capacity for a lot more recharge in-house. And so if you, for instance, were to recharge above use, what would be the metrics on that? Is there an opportunity for a credit on that? Because specifically, I want to incentivize that. I don't want that to be something that just evaporates, literally. If we don't have that incentive, then people aren't going to spend the money on those technologies and those land use practices, and I think that's really, really important. So I'd like to see, some sort of, if we can do that, some sort of a credit for recharge above use specifically, but also just a lot more criteria of users in the metrics of the overall basin.
Thank you, and that is some initial feedback that was heard, and I think that the GSA board and staff is going to be grappling with how to deal with recharge. It's not something that has been identified yet as to what we would do, but it is something that many have expressed interest about, so it's definitely on the radar.
And I think it may not be something that is in the initial fee calculation because it may require additional study and work. So it may not be part of the initial, this is a multi-step process. So the additional, the additional work may give us more to work with on recharge credits, et cetera, in the future. May not be in the next year or two.
Mr. Schwedhelm.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Could you go to slide 8? Because I have a question similar to what the Vice Mayor asked. And could you just tell us on each of the 4 bullet points, if we did the per well charge, who has the authority to make that decision? Is it the GSA board or we have to go to the voters? So just for clarity purposes, could you explain each one of those 4 bullet points? Who's the ultimate authority?
Yes, so there's different noticing and public hearing requirements, but in essence, the per well charge and the per acre foot charge, depending upon the noticing requirements in the public hearing, the GSA board makes those decisions. The per parcel charge and the per acre charge would require a 2/3 vote of the landowners, I think, or the property owners within the basin. So, and that's much, the basin covers from approximately Windsor to Cotati, approximately Sebastopol to the eastern edge of Santa Rosa.
See anybody?
Okay. Ms. Combs.
Thank you, and thank you for bringing the report forward to us. I appreciate it and appreciate the opportunity to get to to work with my colleagues and appointees. It's always good to see us all together every now and then. I have a couple of questions. I thought I heard you indicate that it might not be a Prop 218 regulation. And because of that, I'm wondering if there is a plan for assistance for low or very low income households who are on wells. Because Prop 218 had blocked some of our ability to do that.
So in terms of the per acre foot charge, if we go down that road, it's my understanding we'd have to comply with Prop 218 requirements. The regulatory fees, so looking at a per well charge and some type of regulatory fee, that has to comply with Prop 26. I do believe, and Molly can correct, that there are still limitations in relation to that. And so at this point, it is not something that has been considered, but we can bring that feedback back to see if that is an option that could be considered.
If we can get some creative thinking on assistance for low or very low income households, or possibly for other groups that are providing benefits, like perhaps a nonprofit that's providing housing for homeless people, or community benefits. Will this include an education or conservation program in its implementation?
So currently the fees are for the development of the groundwater sustainability plan as well as the GSA operations for the next few years through 2022. We do absolutely envision that water use efficiency and incentives will be part of the groundwater sustainability plan.
Okay. How long will the grant funding cover costs if it's available?
So the grant funding is a $1 million grant that would be solely for the development of the groundwater sustainability plan. So they're estimating that they would use that money annually as we're going through the process to develop the plan. We'd potentially be starting that development. I mean, we've already kind of started, but we'd be really getting into the meat of it starting next fiscal year through when it's due in January of 2022.
And this is sort of a bigger question, so thank you. This is sort of a bigger question. I don't expect to get the answer today, okay, but if you could give me some idea about the specifics of how sustainability is defined in this document, particularly taking into consideration drought years, the regional planning for population increases, and the measurement systems.
So I can give you some initial information.
I would love to have it, but it's okay to not have things and send it.
Okay.
If others want to hear it, I'll be glad to hear it.
So the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act does define sustainability, and it really is as a protection from any unintended consequences. So not dewatering streams, not having land subsidence, not seeing a drawdown in groundwater levels or water quality. So that's what the law says. As the GSP is developed, there may be other things that the board looks to put in there to define sustainability, but we will comply with the law at a minimum.
Can you explain the drawdown piece?
Looking at
I'm concerned that some wells may do fine, but smaller, shallower wells may have problems.
It's overall looking at the basin and looking at the sort of spring and fall trends and seeing if there's any reduction in the levels.
And as I said, I'm really interested in whether or not we're paying attention to drought years or an increasing number of drought years. Thank you.
Mr. Vice Mayor.
Yeah, just one additional question. In the future, when you bring this back, if you'd also, for the per acre foot and parcel charge, the ones that have to go to the ballot, if you could also bring us the estimate of what the cost to hold the election would be, and whether or not it'd be possible to roll that into this whole package that we're talking about, or if that would be separate, coming from the city or coming from the GSA to hold that election.
Are there any other questions from, yes, Mr. Dowd?
I just have not heard you say this specifically, and I may have missed it, but it seems like there's a great validity to making these a combination of the way we charge both say as an example, the first one is a well charge, then the second one is per acre foot, which is usage. So I suspect there's no exclusion of combining those particular types of rate charges.
Correct. So they're looking at all individually or some combination.
Seeing no other questions here, I do have one card. I have more than one card. We'll start with Mike Martini, followed by Noreen Evans. It's a reunion.
Good afternoon. My name is Mike Martini. I live at 1727 Austin Way here in Santa Rosa. I just want to make 3 quick points, if I may. The first one is that I believe this is a bloated budget. I've had experience doing budgeting in the private sector. I've had experience doing budgeting for the municipality. And then this one, it brings that it's more, what is it that we can raise as opposed to what is it that we need to solve the problem? Which brings it to point number 2. The USGS has done a lot of study on the Santa Rosa Basin, and they have found that the problem exists is somewhere in the range of about 3,500 acre feet per year drawn down. And then as you ask, depending on where you bracket the droughts in, it's either less than that or slightly more than that. This is not a basin that's in a lot of trouble and should not need a lot to make it better. Which brings me to the final point, which is that sustainability in the groundwater system has to have 2 parts to the equation. The first one is obviously extraction. Everybody talks about extraction, but the other part of it is recharge. And if you go to the USGS studies, they show that the recharge system, as the water comes down from the hills, passes through Santa Rosa, goes out through the lagoon and out to the ocean. Our practice for years in Santa Rosa was to move that water as fast as possible. We wanted to deal with flooding issues, so we channelized all the water, and that water moves out very, very quickly. Now, as we look at it in terms of sustainability and groundwater recharge, we need to rethink that. So where we have paved over within the municipality of Santa Rosa that does not allow for recharge, we still have the lagoon and all of the agricultural interests out there that have the potential for recharge. So I ask that as you think about this and you think about how to move forward, you think about, and I really appreciate the question of credit for recharge is a very important one. And finally, I just want to say that I really appreciate Councilmember Schwedhelm's participation on the GSA. My history with the city of Santa Rosa was doing a lot of the similar kinds of things around water, and I want you to know he's doing a better job than I ever did. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Noreen Evans, and she'll be followed by Thomas Ells.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor and Chair and members. I'm Noreen Evans, 70 Stony Point Road, Santa Rosa, and as you know, I served in the state legislature for 10 years, retiring in 2014. And during my 10 years in the legislature, we tried 3 times to pass some form of a Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. And I was one of the co-authors of this act that you are now implementing. And I just happened to be here for another item. I wanted to thank you for your hard work. It's not often I get to see my local electeds and appointees in action, actually implementing something that we passed in the state legislature. I realize that this is challenging and it's difficult and it's very complex, but sustainable management of California's groundwater is an issue of statewide importance and important very much for the future of our communities and our future generations. And so I just wanted to say thank you for the hard work you're doing.
Thank you. Thomas Ells.
Thank you for having these hearings. It's been a long time coming. Forgive me if I mention that I proposed this to my congressman, watershed management in 1990 and 1992. He was the minority leader of the Public Works Committee at the time, which was a very important position regarding the gas tax and spending that to protect watersheds. Recommend that you consider analyzing usage distribution. So there's some users who use a lot of water, similar to what Chris was saying, and a lot of users that don't use very much water. So a combination fee is very, as Mr. Dowd said, could be important, parcels, water wells, and usage, but also to consider overusage and penalty regarding the overusage that could be really important. Some people, they're going to manage their water use, but I think it's really important. And it's really great. I know the county brought on maybe 10 geologists to do I think there's about 10 people in their water agency to do groundwater management and so on. Very important. And looking forward to seeing what the results are. Thank you.
Thank you. That's all the cards I have. If there are no further questions, I want to thanks for bringing this forward. It's been a while since we've heard about it. I know that Mr. Schwedhelm has been steeped in this stuff over the last several months, but it's good to hear how things are progressing. Thank you. With that, we'll move on to item 3.2. And I just want to make a couple of announcements for folks who are here. I know there are a lot of people here who don't usually come to city council meetings, so I just want to let you know how we usually operate around here. We're going to get a staff report, much like we did on the last item. We'll have some questions from the board and from council. I'm going to ask my colleagues up here to keep our questions to the short, necessary ones to start, because I know there are a lot of folks who have come today who have your own questions, and we want to hear those too. When you come up to speak, first of all, you'll have 3 minutes. We try and keep things moving. We aren't able to engage in back and forth when you come up to speak here. If you have questions, we'll take note of them. We'll get answers to them after the public comment portion is finished. We may not have answers to all your questions today, and I think everybody understands that. We're working to get them, and we'll hear how far that work has gone as we start our item. So, Ms. Hurtado, item 3.2.
Thank you, Mayor. Item 3.2, update on water quality advisory for Fountain Grove area. Director Ben Hornstein presenting.
Good afternoon, Mayor Corsi, council members, Chair Galvin, BPU members. I'm Ben Hornstein, Director of Water for the City of Santa Rosa. This presentation and discussion today is intended to provide you with a status update on the water quality contamination issue that we have as an aftermath of the fires.
Mr. Hornstein, I'm sorry to interrupt, but would you pull that microphone a little closer so everybody can hear?
Okay, is that... We'll be providing you today with the latest on the results of our ongoing investigation, where staff is headed towards fashioning our recommendation on a repair approach to bring the system to the pre-fire condition it was, in a number of related items. This is an ongoing effort. We're bringing today a lot of information to you with answers to many of the questions you may have. We'll likely not have answers to every question the folks have here today. We'll continue certainly to work very hard and do our best to develop approaches and responses that fully respond to all of the related interests and needs of our community as quickly as we can. Given this is a status update, we will not be bringing a specific recommendation today, but we do look forward to the comments and feedback we receive. Taking a step back briefly, over the past 4 months, we have compiled a team of technical experts, scientists, engineers, chemists, national water quality experts, internal, external, to understand, investigate, and develop a solution to this water quality contamination. It does take a considerable amount of time to work through this effort, to work through an effort of this magnitude, to both understand and to resolve this, particularly as there's no template or lessons learned to look for out in the industry. We are a bit leading this effort. The policy direction you have provided to staff is ever present in our thinking and our approach to this work, to do everything we can to support the rebuild effort and to heal this community in an expeditious fashion, while at the same time, we of course need to get this effort right. Ensuring the health and safety of the residents has and will always be the top priority, the guiding mission of the Water Department, and that has remained so during this episode of contamination. We are managing this key concern through very close and constant collaboration with our partner regulatory agencies generally and specifically as it relates to ongoing review of the data and considering and developing appropriate water quality advisories to the affected portions of the public. We are doing our best to keep the community informed about this issue, yet we can always do better. And we continue to work on and improve our website and the many other means of providing information to the community. To present the information today, we have Jennifer Burke, Deputy Director in the Water Department, who's been an overall lead on this effort. Emma Walton, one of our professional engineers on staff. Ken Patton, an outside expert forensic chemist from Apex Laboratory, one of a number of outside experts we've brought in. Joe Schiavone, Deputy Director of the Water Department, who manages the operation of our water system. And Lori Urbanik, Deputy Director in Transportation Public Works, who will be managing the repair portion of this effort. In the audience today, we also have Janice Thomas and Marianne Watato, both from the State Water Board Division of Drinking Water, part of the regulatory partners we've been working with on this. So with that, I'll hand off to the first presenter, Ms. Burke.
Thank you, Director Hornstein. So just quickly, we're going to do some background information, and then we're going to give some pretty detailed information about the investigation, and then talk about repair options that we've looked at and what's possible, as well as talking about funding and next steps. So first, just to orient the council and the board, we wanted to give a little bit of an overview of the city's water system. You'll see in front of you, this is an outline of the city limits, and the dark red lines, which actually kind of look a little black up there. Those are the aqueducts that run through our system that are providing the water from the Sonoma County Water Agency. And those are connected to the city's distribution system, and it's how we basically receive water. In general, there's more flat areas of the city. We rely on the agency's water storage and tanks as well as pressure to operate that system. In the hilly areas, we have a number of pump stations and reservoirs where we're basically needing to generate our own pressure for the water system. So we pump water up to reservoirs, it's stored, and then we use gravity as well to distribute that water. And then you'll see in the green outlined area up above, that is the water quality advisory area that we'll be talking about today. In general, just to give some sort of how big it is, that is roughly 184 acres in comparison to the entire city, which is about 26,125 acres. And our distribution system is throughout the majority of the system of the city. So we wanted to give a little overview of how the fire occurred and the interaction with our system. So this map, you'll see the red crosshatch shows the burned area, the fire perimeter. And then you'll see our water system as well, and the sort of letters and numbers up there represent different pressure zones within our system, which are fed by different reservoirs. As the fire moved through the area, unfortunately, devastatingly, homes were destroyed, leaving open pipes that released water from our system, which allowed water to drain. And as this demand became greater than the supply in our system, we experienced a drop in pressure. And working with our regulators, we issued an initial boil water notice during the fires, and we conducted our required samples after a drop in pressure, which would be bacteria tests. All of those routine tests came back clean, and so we were able to lift those notices. And then that area was evacuated for quite some time. So in early November, folks were allowed to re-enter the burned areas. And shortly after that re-entry occurred, we received a taste and odor complaint from one of the residents within the area. So we sent our staff out immediately to investigate that taste and odor complaint and took some initial samples. And we realized that it seemed a little different, so we also tested for some additional things like hydrocarbons. And once we received those results and working closely with our regulators, we found that there was contamination, in particular benzene, that was above the maximum contaminant level, or MCL. Based on that initial information, working with our regulators, we issued a water quality advisory, basically telling folks not to drink on November the 10th. And then, as we'll talk about in a few slides, we broadened and deepened the investigation, and in doing so, we have found some additional contaminants, and in general, led to some additional precautions, which we put out on January 23rd. So this really was an unprecedented event, and all of our research and all of our talking with other water agencies that have experienced fires, no one had experienced this type of contamination before that we were aware of. We weren't able to find anyone who experienced this. We do know that benzene has been the most pervasive and highest concentrations and is a true indicator chemical for post-fire contamination. We also know, because of the fire and the damage, that a range of contaminants related to the fire are in the water. And so we really are looking at this closely and doing this investigation, working closely with our regulators as well as toxicologists. And we do know, based on their information and recommendation, that benzene continues to be the indicator contaminant that is driving all of the health precautions as well as the water quality advisory for this area. And just so that the council and the board and the public is aware, the MCL, or maximum contaminant level, for benzene is 1 part per billion, which is a very, very low concentration. So when we initially determined that we had this water contamination issue, we worked closely with our regulators and notified existing customers right away. Really was our intent to make sure we were looking at public health and safety, especially for those that were remaining in the water quality advisory area. We knew there were 13 homes, and we were communicating with them through door hangers, door to door, trying to get them information. And we began really trying to flesh and do some certain things that you'll hear about in more detail, and initially thought we could clear this up pretty quickly. That is the standard protocol that MOOCs would use to deal with a contamination issue. And as we continued to resample, we realized that it was a little bit more than the normal protocol, and we weren't able to get rid of it with initial flushing. So again, working closely with our regulators, we developed an action plan. And then we also reached out. We reached out to local, state, and federal regulators. We reached out to other water agencies. We reached out in many different ways for any type of contamination to see if anyone had any experience, any knowledge, anything that they could provide to help us try and understand this a little bit better, to provide recommendations on what to look for. And based on all that research and outreach, again, we've recognized that this is pretty unprecedented and haven't found others that have experienced this, but it also led us to find national water quality experts as well as toxicologists and forensic chemists. And you'll hear from one of the forensic chemists that's working with a team on some of the investigation and the data that they found, and really have been working closely to tap all resources that we can to help really guide this investigation and help us determine how we can clear up this contamination. So working with that group and working with their guidance, we started to really deepen and broaden the investigation. We expanded the investigation throughout the entire burn area, so not just in initially the water quality advisory, but expanded it throughout the entire burn area. And by the time we are concluded, we will have tested every single water service line within the burned area. As information came back and working closely with our regulators as well as toxicologists, we did update the health advisories, and we started to provide bottled drinking water to those that are still within the advisory, as well as adjusting their water bills appropriately. As Director Hornstein has mentioned, communication is challenging. This is a very methodical, intensive investigation. We'll talk about in a minute, but we literally have hundreds and thousands of data points that we've been getting in and managing, as well as approximately over 3,000 samples that we have taken, as well as working with our partner agencies and researching and understanding. So trying to focus on the investigation, focusing on protecting public health and trying to understand how this happened and working on a resolution, and then trying to communicate that out in various forums has been a bit challenging. We have done a number of in-person visits, in particular in the water quality advisory area, hanging door hangers, as well as delivering water, responding to questions. We have mailed some letters, and last week in particular sent out a letter to over 4,000 property owners within the whole fire-affected area. We are working on emails, and we understand that those have been a little challenging. We just found out this week that we thought they were going through, and it doesn't appear they are. So we're going to have to revisit and figure out how to do that a little bit better. We've been attending various community meetings, as well as one of the homeowners in the area did set up a meeting and invited us to attend, which we did. We've been working on other avenues, whether it's social media or a website, to really try and get the word out. One of the ways that we have been getting updates out is through our e-newsletter to provide an update. And if anyone is interested in signing up and not getting this e-newsletter, you can go to our website, which is srcity.org/WQ advisory, and sign up to receive that newsletter. We're trying to push information out that way. And to date, we have about an 18% open rate based on our metrics, which is actually a really good number for those type of email broadcasts. We have been using social media and really trying to get the word out through any kind of avenue that we can to provide updates. We do know that there are at least some folks that are using this methodology for getting updates, because we have been getting some questions and responses through our social media channels. We've also been communicating and trying to get information out through the news media, working closely not only with our local print news, but also reaching out through press releases and other avenues to television and radio, and in some cases they have actually asked and done some interviews, and so we continue to use that method as well to get information out. As I mentioned, our website is also available. It's a dedicated web page, and it has a lot of detailed information, as well as a map, which I'll talk about in just a second, for sample data. And we also have links from the Sonoma County Recovers.org website, as well as links from our homepage and our water homepage. And for just this page alone, not the website as a whole, but, and I think this number is a little outdated, but we have seen about 2,000 page views, a little over that. So we do think that this is an avenue folks are using as well to really try and get updated information. And more recently, we have developed a searchable GIS-based map to try and get sampling data out. As I mentioned a little bit ago, we have conducted over 3,000 samples, whether they're investigative samples or water quality samples, and it's resulted in over hundreds of thousands of data points coming from those analyses. And to try and get the information out that is most useful to the public, we were trying in different ways and basically have developed this searchable GIS map that has a lot of tools. You can enter an address to get the actual results. It'll zoom you right in. You can highlight an area and it'll tell you all the results in that area. And you can click on the dots and it'll tell you specific sample results. It is providing the most recent sample result, as that is the most recent and reflective of the investigation and the water quality to date. And so with that, I'm going to turn this over to Emma Walton, who's going to walk you through the investigation.
Thank you, Jennifer. I will be covering our investigation of the contamination, in essence walking through how we determined the source of the contamination. So we started and approached this investigation in a methodical, scientific manner, really in an attempt to not prematurely rule out any sources or jump to conclusions or overlook anything. We started by considering all the possible sources of the contamination of the benzene and the associated contaminants. We went through a series of investigative efforts and lab and field tests to attempt to either rule out or rule in our various hypotheses. And from those efforts, we were able to rule out a number of sources and able to really narrow in on what the source of this contamination actually is. So what are all the possible sources? We started by considering how contamination of any sort can enter a water distribution system. We know that it can enter our water distribution system through three pathways: leaching, permeation, and backflow. From there, we identified how this specific contamination, the contamination we were seeing, the benzene and the other contaminants, how it could be present in our system with respect to each of these pathways. So leaching typically occurs when system components begin to degrade and break down over time. And leaching occurs from plastic pipes, epoxy coatings and linings, and it can be exacerbated when plastics are introduced or exposed to elevated temperatures like the temperatures we experienced during the fires. Permeation is when a contaminant that's present on the outside of the pipe, in the ground or in the soil and in the groundwater actually moves through the pipe walls and is introduced into the drinking water system. It's known that contaminants like benzene and contaminants that are in fuel and diesel and gasoline will permeate plastic pipes. It's known in the industry, and that's why when we install pipes in areas of known contamination, we use alternative materials like ductile iron or copper to prevent this kind of contamination in our system. Backflow is exactly as it sounds. It's when instead of water flowing from the distribution mains to homes and businesses, water flow is reversed and it flows from the homes and businesses and is pulled into the mains themselves. Backflow contamination can occur from improper hookups and cross connections. We had many firefighters in the area hooking up to our system in efforts to fight the fire, many from outside agencies. After the fires were out, we had a force of contractors hooking up to our system to aid in cleanup efforts, and we had to consider that an improper connection could have been made, forcing contamination back into our system. Backflow can also occur when there's a loss of pressure. And as Deputy Director Burke mentioned, we did experience a loss of pressure during the fires. We had breaks in our system. We had a huge demand from firefighting efforts. We had power outages and damage to our infrastructure that just exacerbated the issue. And we know that benzene is a byproduct of fires and of combustion of building materials. So it's possible that through that loss of pressure, we back siphoned or drew in contamination from the atmosphere or any other contamination that happened to be present at the burned sites. To start narrowing down the list of the potential contamination sources, we went through a series of concerted efforts. We took water samples to understand the specific nature and the extent of the contamination. We took soil samples to identify if this contamination could be coming from contaminated soil. We sent material samples of our system components to Apex Laboratories, who you'll hear from in a minute, to undergo physical and chemical evaluation. We did cross-connection surveys in an attempt to identify any improper hookups or setups. We undertook extensive literature reviews to not only understand where the contamination could have come from, but also understand how this contamination could potentially be affecting our water system. We also did records research to understand when and how the system was built, the historic land use to identify the potential for underground storage tanks, and also to verify that this contamination in any amount or at any time was not present in our system before the fires. To get a little more in depth, when I say we took water samples, I don't mean we took a few water samples. As Deputy Director Burke mentioned, we've taken thousands of water samples, and we are nearly complete with sampling every burned and unburned home in the fire-impacted area. We have a team of 20 certified water samplers. They're taking around 175 water samples a day. They're being analyzed for thousands of compounds. We've actually maxed out the capacity of our internal laboratory resources, who have been working around the clock to assist in this effort, and we've employed the help of 3 outside commercial laboratories. We were unable to even find one commercial laboratory able to take on the amount of analysis that we needed through this effort. Similarly, soil samples were taken throughout the advisory area. A broad array of samples were taken just to canvass the entire area and categorize the entire area, as well as more focused samples were taken where we were finding the highest levels of contamination in the water. We really did want to make sure we were not overlooking kind of the notion that this could just be coming from a leaking underground fuel tank or a fuel spill. We also, as I mentioned, have taken representative samples of nearly every component of our distribution system and have sent them to Apex Laboratories. We've taken pieces and valves out, shown in the first picture. We've taken sections of our main line. We've sent in gaskets that hold the pipes together. We've sent in service lines and meters. Really, any component we could put in the mail, we sent off to be analyzed both physically and chemically. We really felt this was an important aspect of the investigation. We have to have a clear understanding of how this contamination has affected our infrastructure. It's really vital information that will help direct our approach to restoring the system. So what did all of that investigative efforts tell us? First, it told us that this is not a fuel contamination, either from a spill or a previously leaking storage tank. There's no evidence to support that. Soil contamination in the area. There's no historic land use that would indicate underground storage tank. There's no historic contamination in the quarterly routine samples that we take on our water system. And the sporadic nature of the contamination and the varying concentrations that we're seeing from every sample really does not support the idea that this could be coming from a single point source. So what does it tell us? Everything we've found to date, everything in analyzing the water samples and analyzing the material samples in all the literature review we've done supports that this contamination is from leaching from the plastics of our system. And it was introduced from backflow of burned and melted plastics, and as well as from soot and ash and other fire debris that was present at burn sites when we lost pressure. So I'll kind of walk through how it happened. It might make a little more sense. Under normal conditions, the water system is pressurized and flows from the distribution mains through water services to homes and businesses. While this is pretty intuitive, it's actually an important feature that helps maintain the water quality integrity of every single water system. Every system inherently has cracks and leaks, and when pressure is maintained, water flows from those cracks and leaks out and prevents contamination from coming into the system. When we lost pressure during the fire, open, exposed, burned, severed service lines allowed for contamination to be back siphoned into our system. And in some instances, that's where it stayed. It stayed in the water services themselves. But in the advisory area, we experienced something much different. The water loss in the system was to such a great extent that the contamination was pulled deep into the system and contaminated the mains as well as the services. We have been able to come to this conclusion with the support of water quality experts as well as Apex Laboratories. Apex has been providing the city with an independent analysis of water samples, soil samples, material samples, and Kent Patton with Apex is here to tell you a bit about what they've been doing to support this effort and the conclusions that they've been able to come to through their investigation.
Until you do the test, it's really just a hypothesis. It's a theory. And at Apex, we were asked, to confirm what is the origin of this contaminant, this benzene, these products in the water. And so Apex Laboratory was focused on contaminant and source identification. And so water quality testing was being done by commercial laboratories following EPA methods, looking for specific contaminants. And to find the source, you really have to understand the origin of where these compounds could come from. And being a forensic lab that deals with petroleum contaminated releases and also in the recycling efforts of creation of fuels from plastics, we have a lot of experience from both sides, from releases and also the pyrolysis of plastics to form useful feedstocks and petroleum products. So we did analysis of water, soil, the piping, and the other materials that Emma mentioned. We looked at these organic and inorganic contaminants. We also, to understand what types of temperatures that the piping was exposed to, did physical testing and microscopic analysis following ASTM methods, D1245, to look at the types of particles that were entrained and then deposited inside the piping. So a little more on the physical testing. We did microscopic evaluations of 18 different samples, which included both materials that were PVC, high-density polyethylene. We looked at meters, valves, wedges, and gaskets. We looked for exposure to high heat, and we looked at how those different parts of the infrastructure were maintained and how they changed. So we really were looking microscopically at the variety of particles or the malformation of the original products. And we did a lot of work looking at char, smoke in sections of the pipe. So here's a picture of one of the mains. And in this figure, you can see at the top of the main, there's a sooty dark film. It's been rubbed clean in a few places, but figure 2 shows you about a 20 millimeter section of piping that we took some specific samples to identify what was there. You can
Could you lean into the mic? You have a good, clear voice, but the folks watching the stream will not be able to hear you.
Thank you. Is this better? Okay. So you can look at the pipe. That is the material that's on that pipe, and I'll move back and forth here. That's actually that small section of pipe. What you see is what we call cenospheres or carbon hulls that were formed during high heat. An aerosol was formed. It burned out the center and left a carbon hull. You often look at that as soot or char. That was carried into the pipe. And can I go backwards to the slide? Okay. So that is what you see on this pipe. You see that there's also different levels of contrast. And that is following where there was more smoke in the top of the pipe, and you can see at what level the water dropped into that pipe. And that's where you see that the smoke and soot and char is stuck. These particles are very sticky, and so they bind well onto the surface of the pipe. They also are made of carbon, and carbon is a great sink for collecting volatile or gaseous components from burn. So in addition to those pieces and components of the system we looked at, we analyzed water and soil. And instead of looking at just the components that are listed on the EPA methods, we did NIST library scans in our organic analysis of over 70,000 potential chemicals. And the results identified areas of the water system that were clearly impacted by fire. And we also found that the most prevalent compound and the leading indicator was benzene out of all of the compounds that we were looking for and tested. One of the questions was, if the piping has been exposed to these artifacts from burning, or from combustion, or from oxygen-deprived burning, which would be pyrolysis, how much of these chemicals might leach out of these different materials? So to do this determination, we used an EPA method 1311. On the left, you see in the middle a zero headspace extractor. What we extracted in this to make sure we didn't lose any volatile components that could have been leached by water during the extraction process. We had it in the sealed containers. For 69 hours, we let these samples tumble to leach out in ultra-pure water what components might go through dissolution into the water. And so we had samples of burned high-density polyethylene. We had samples of pipe that was new. We had the seals and gaskets along with sections of main. We also took apart the meters that were burned and the meters that weren't burned to get a comparison of samples. And so we did those leachate tests, and we found indeed we had from the original burnt or heat damaged material, we had the benzene. We did then a cleaning, which was just a water washing with physical force to try to remove surface contamination, and we did leaching of the pipe, and again both for high density polyethylene and PVC, and we had results of low level benzene after that process. So our preliminary findings. The contamination present is related to fire damage through the thermal degradation of system components, such as resins and plastics. Entry of ash, soot, and other debris into the piping and ancillary equipment happened during the fire event. We found it all the way into the main lines, not just near the residences. The contamination is not present due to gasoline. That was a very reasonable theory. USTs and gasoline leaks, we're all probably familiar with the benzene or MTB or other components. We did fingerprinting of the profiles from these waters compared to the profiles, and the component mixtures are different. So we're not looking at a contamination from dissolution of spilled product. We are looking at pyrogenic sources. And so we have done our first round of identification and characterization of these contaminants for this study.
Turn on your mic, please.
Thank you.
There you go.
The work that Apex has done and is continuing to do is really essential in helping inform the specific nature of the contamination and identifying how it has impacted our system. In parallel, the city has been taking thousands of water samples that I previously referenced, and those samples have really been used to identify the extent of the contamination. And we found that outside of the advisory area, the extent of the contamination is much different than inside the advisory area. Outside the advisory area, we are finding contamination in some service lines, but we are not finding evidence that the main lines are contaminated. And this is in direct contrast with inside the advisory area, where we are finding contamination in all of the service lines and as well as the mains. To kind of put this in context, outside the advisory area, we've taken on the magnitude of thousands of samples and have found somewhere in the 50 range of contaminated contaminated service lines. So out of thousands of samples, about 50 contaminated services. Inside the advisory area, we've sampled every single home and burnt property in the magnitude of about 350 service lines, and we've found about 350 contaminated service lines. So these two areas are very distinct.
Ms. Walton, this map is different from the area that you showed before. Could you tell us what the dark blue dots indicate?
The dark blue dots indicate samples that were taken that come in below the MCL, the maximum contaminant level of 1 part per billion.
So they represent no contamination.
They represent no contamination.
Thank you.
Understanding the extent of the contamination is most importantly to ensure the health and safety of the public. But understanding the extent and where the contamination specifically resides is also helping inform how we're going to resolve the issue, how we're going to restore the system. And I'll now hand it off to Deputy Director Schiavone to discuss our current approach to restoring the system.
Thank you, Ms. Walton. Good afternoon. Now I'd like to describe potential options for restoring the system, the alternatives we considered, and our current approach to restoring the system. When we initially found the contamination, and as we would, would be standard practice, we quickly started flushing our system. Flushing is a common method of removing contamination from a distribution system. It allows you to move clean water through the system, pushing the contamination out an opening such as a hydrant. During our investigation, we tried several flushing methods in the advisory area, including directional flushing, flushing of all appurtenances, such as hydrants, air relief valves, blow-off valves, and service lines. These appurtenances have all been flushed several times over the past few months. We even tried a constant flushing method that allowed us to supply the system at one end with clean water and flush the contaminated water out the opposite end. We explored the option of pigging. Pigging is a foam device that is pushed or pulled from one end of the system to the other, removing contamination as it travels through the pipe. We pigged isolated portions of the system by inserting this foam device at one end of the water main and forcing it through the system, hoping to push or wipe the contaminant out of the system as it exited the opposite end. After this process was completed, we pressurized the water mains with truck-supplied water and analyzed the water that sat in these portions of the system. We tried partial replacement of the system components to remove contamination in the advisory area. For example, we replaced hydrants, valves, service lines, and other system components that are connected to our water mains. After replacing these items, we found that low levels of contamination were still present in post-replacement water samples. It is important to point out that partial replacement of contaminated components outside the advisory area has been effective in removing contamination. Our post-replacement water samples outside the advisory area continue to show positive results. So during our investigation, we flushed an estimated 1.6 million gallons of clean water through our distribution system to remove the contamination. We also pigged water mains and tried to mechanically remove the contaminants. Flushing and pigging proved ineffective in completely removing the contaminant from the distribution system. Although both methods were effective in reducing the level of contamination, neither would completely remove it. We found that when the flushing stopped, the contaminant would return and the levels would slowly increase over time. The additional review and pipe analysis performed by Apex Laboratories confirmed that the contamination remained in the system even after it had been flushed. We researched the use of surfactants. Treating the system with surfactants consists of adding a chemical, essentially a soap, to the system, hoping it provides a deeper clean than the clean water alone. Our team researched literature on the use of surfactants and found that these are not a reliable option when the contaminant has absorbed into the gasket and pipe material. Our research showed that the use of these chemicals can also cause damage to our distribution system when they are used at a concentration level high enough to remove the contaminant. We also explored the option of treatment and filtration. Treatment and filtration can be effective methods of removing contaminants from water, but these methods are only effective really when the contaminants are in the source water themselves or itself. In our situation, the contamination is in portions of the system itself, and it's not the source water that's contaminated. Our current approach outside the advisory area has been partial replacement. Outside the advisory area, we have only found detectable levels of contamination in the service lines. When we find a service line that has a detectable level, the lines are either isolated, removed, or replaced. And when water samples are taken after the service line has been replaced, we are not finding detectable levels of contamination. Considering the information and data collected at this point of the investigation, it appears that full replacement seems to be the likely option for restoring the system inside the advisory area. As we mentioned in this presentation, our efforts of cleaning, flushing, and partial replacement in this area have not been effective in completely removing the contaminant from the system. Preliminary results from Apex Laboratories show that the contaminant will continue to leach from the pipes, gaskets, and other plastic components for an undetermined amount of time. Without the ability to completely remove the contaminant, we would need to pursue the route of determining the level of contamination that could be expected to remain in the system with only partial replacement. Although full replacement of the system would have time and other constraints, at this point, without fully understanding the impacts of partial replacement inside the advisory area, we continue to look at what is needed for the option of full replacement. And now Deputy Director Urbanik will explain the design and construction process necessary for full replacement.
So under a full replacement in the advisory zone, the project scope would replace approximately 5 miles of water main, 350 service lines, 70 fire hydrants, and 210 valves. I'd also like to point out in this slide what is not captured is the feed line that goes up the parkway to about Newgate Court. We would need to replace that portion of the main as well.
Ms. Urbanik, please stay close to that microphone.
Thank you, sir.
Good.
As far as we've been asked to take a look at this project and try to determine on a very high level how we could possibly accelerate the design and construction of this project. Currently, we are consulting with several experts on an expedited design and different construction options, which would include design build versus a traditional design bid build scenario. A typical project of this scale and this complexity would probably take several years in planning, design, and then finally into construction. Options that we're considering that could potentially help accelerate this schedule, there are a couple of these. So the first option, as Ms. Walton discussed earlier, the test analysis of the ground and the underlying soil showed that that area was not contaminated. Should that area have been contaminated, we'd be looking at a redesign and to replace the current pipe network with likely ductile iron pipe. That would be a significant design effort and a significant amount of time. Fortunately, that's not the case, so we're able to use the same type of material that is predominantly located in this area, and that's polyvinyl chloride, otherwise known as PVC pipe. PVC currently meets our city standards and complies with state and industry requirements. The second way we feel like we could accelerate this system, since the system is relatively new, it's on the order of 20 to 35 years old. This means that we have complete sets of the plans that constructed this system as a subdivision, as many subdivisions actually. These original plans, actually let me explain what record drawings are. They're the original plans that were used during construction, and they have been edited for any modifications that occurred to the original design during construction. By using these drawings, it would significantly reduce our design phase of the project and possibly could save us up to 18 to 24 months. So essentially, using these drawings, the project becomes more of a remove and replace in-kind scenario with some minor design modifications that would include upsizing some pipe from 6 to 8 inch, some 10-inch pipe to 12-inch pipe. And then there is one subdivision where we would change the material completely. It's the oldest subdivision in the area, and there is asbestos cement pipe located there. We would bring that up to current standards and install PVC pipe there. We are also considering a number of methods to help incentivize the contractors for early completion. It's important to note that we would want to have a lot of flexibility in the schedule to accommodate the contractor's ability to be flexible and move around different obstacles as they come up. Another way to accelerate construction is we'd want to take out large portions of the system at a time, and we would proceed sort of in a stepwise approach, going through neighborhoods and taking off these systems offline. In this situation, it would be necessary to put the existing 13 homes on a separate water supply. This would allow us to take out these large segments without having to worry about a very quick reconnection for the residents that reside there now. As the contractor completed this remove and place exercise, there would be large portions of neighborhoods that would come back online sooner than later. And we imagine this being stepwise throughout the project. These neighborhoods would be hooked up then to clean water, and we would keep moving with the reconstruction activities. Finally, we recognize that there's going to be probably a lot of different contractors out there working. An unknown number of housing contractors working through the rebuild activities. We'll need to coordinate extensively with fire and ensure that as these homes are being rebuilt, that we're providing adequate temporary fire supply, not only to the 13 homes that exist there as the system is taken down and then restored, but also as the building effort starts to accelerate and we start to get clusters of framing activities going on. We would have to increase the density and the location of this temporary fire suppression equipment to make sure that we have adequate coverage. So you can imagine that that temporary fire suppression system is essentially tankers sitting in the street, just holding water in the event it becomes necessary. We would coordinate regularly with the fire department on our activities to make sure that they were aware of where we were, what systems that we had taken out of service effectively. There's also the potential for major other large projects to be in the area, such as PG&E, telephone, cable, and other public projects that need to be repaired and replaced during this same time period. And that includes the streetlight system up in this area. First and foremost, we need to ensure that the system is not recontaminated as we go through this rebuild exercise. This may mean that we're not able to complete the reconstruction in what appears to be the absolute shortest time possible. The situation that I've been talking about actually replaces the system more in a series fashion, where you're taking out segments, replacing it, hooking it up to clean water, and then moving methodically through the system. We are working with a number of consulting engineers who are currently analyzing our construction sequencing using a hydraulic model to help us plan the various system responses as portions of the system are taken on and offline. And as I mentioned, this rebuild process will need to coordinate a lot of these construction activities to minimize scheduling surprises for everybody involved. Also, during this time, we'll coordinate again regularly with the fire department and, continuously move this temporary fire suppression around as more and more neighborhoods are taken offline and more neighborhoods are put back online with clean water. But as with most underground projects, there's the challenge of the unexpected situations. In this slide, you'll see that there's a blue water main pipe that's located in the advisory area. We took a number of potholes locations during the soil analysis, so we had an understanding of what we may encounter. This happens to be somewhat of a surprise to us since this is a newer subdivision. We wouldn't necessarily anticipate that the orange pipeline on top of our water main is a 4-inch gas main. And the conduit that is adjacent to that is likely cable TV or, some other dry utility. We know about this location now. There's miles of what we don't know about yet. So this will be an extensive coordination with PG and other utilities, as they will need to deactivate and de-energize their system prior to our ability to go in and work in this situation. We have been in contact with PG&E, and we still are not aware of what plans they may have in that area. Now for construction timing. I just want everybody to recognize that this is a very high-level first pass, and as I mentioned, we are continuing to work with our engineering consultants on evaluating risks and time benefit as we start to take a deeper dive into what this would really look like as a construction schedule. For now, our best case looks like it's approximately 2 years. And this is 2 years using record drawings, which saves us design from doing the design. It utilizes a limited amount of redesign, bringing things up to current code, as I recently mentioned. It also uses the same pipe material and also taking advantage of coordinating public and private construction activities, thus minimizing delay to this project and others in the rebuild area. Restoring our clean, safe drinking water is our highest priority. As I mentioned earlier, we may not be able to reconstruct the water system in the shortest time possible. And folks can look at the map and they'll wonder, why can't you do? As I mentioned again, there's some hydraulic capacity issues, and there's also sensitivity about recontaminating the system. So we are continuing to analyze that and trying to find the most expeditious way should this project need to be constructed. So there are some external factors that Thank you. That we are working on too. We're trying to coordinate with other construction activities. And as I mentioned, we just don't know what all of those are going to look like. We don't know how quickly folks are going to be rebuilding in this area. We don't know what PG&E's plans. We don't know what Comcast's plans are. So these are all things that we're trying to gain information so we can start to understand and account for these other factors that could potentially make that 2-year scenario grow longer. Weather is a big factor for us in this situation as well. We don't know if next winter is going to be a drought year or it's going to be the newest, wettest season on record. And again, unforeseen underground conditions are going to dominate this construction activity. We just don't know what we don't know at this moment in time. And with that, I'll turn it over to Director Hornstein to discuss funding and next steps.
In regards to funding, at this point, we are looking at it under the assumption of kind of the worst case, which would be the full system replacement in the advisory area and the targeted service line replacements outside of it. The estimated costs are $30 to $40 million currently, and we are working with our BPU Budget Committee looking at funding options, including reserves and including pulling from existing capital projects that are in some stage of movement. And we do continue, of course, to work with FEMA and Cal OES to ensure that this project is and will remain an eligible project so the city can get reimbursement, but also to explore early funding alternatives to assist in cash flow that would potentially, for example, decrease how much we have to pull from our catastrophic reserves or from other areas that have downstream costs and impacts. In terms of next steps, the last slide here is certainly ongoing communications, and I will say enhanced communications with affected parties, continuing the investigation with our expert team, concluding the outcomes and final confirmation on our theories with data. As you just heard, continuing to explore expedited construction approaches, and design build was one example, but there are other concepts out there that we're being informed with by outside experts that do a lot of creative construction contracting approaches. Looking at the funding options, and of course continuing to keep the council and the board up to date on our activities, with ultimately a recommendation for restoring the water quality back to pre-fire conditions in this area and throughout the city. That concludes our formal presentation, and we'll take questions.
Thank you all. It's an incredibly complex problem with layers and layers of complications. We'll get questions from council and board members before we take public comment, but I'd like to ask those of us up here to realize these folks have been waiting to ask their questions too. So if you have a question that can wait until later on, hang on to it. Otherwise, if you have burning questions, we'll start with the Board of Public Utilities.
Any board members need to ask questions yet? Board Member Grable.
Yeah, I have one quick question. As far as, we know that with the combination of a leach and a backflow that we've got to invest in replacement, it sounds like there's no other, viable option in terms of achieving certainty that we've addressed this, and I think that's what everybody's interested in. My comment and question would be, as we're investing in replacement, can we also invest in innovation and preventative measures? Are there additional devices that we can look to, for instance, isolation shutoff valves with test ports to really be able to address this in a more, contained, segmented fashion in the future. I know that a lot of double check valves are prone to failure, things that are, were commonly used maybe 30 years ago. We could look at current technologies, not just to replace what we have, but to have some preventative measure for, let's be honest, if there's a fire in the future, we don't want to have to do this again, as much as, we all would seek to prevent that from happening. But if we're going to make this investment, which is huge, I'd like to look at additional preventative measures.
Yes, we will look at, and I believe what I'm hearing is look at strategic enhancements to the system that make sense in context of the time frame we're working, but let's not lose sight for the opportunities that may be there to improve things.
Any members of the council? Mr. Vice Mayor.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. And I'll hold off on almost all of my questions until after public comment, but I did want to ask, I see a lot of neighbors who are here. Don't just ask your questions if you would. If you have an unmet need, make sure you tell us as well so that we can make sure that staff is able to assist you. So get questions answered and let us know if there are any unmet needs.
Ms. Combs.
I'll hold most of my questions for later, but I do want to pursue along the lines of BPU member Grable, the question of using ductile iron versus using plastic, what the cost difference is. I, of course, am concerned that this is not the only fire this area will have in the future, and want to make sure that the prevention piece is clear.
We do understand there's a lot of questions and understandable concerns about replacing in kind with plastic that contributed to this issue. We will be bringing back with our recommendation much more details around this. I do want to share that the use of materials in a system like ours is complex. There's industry standards, and it's a balancing of a number of factors. Particularly in this area, seismic activity is devastating for an underground piping system. And plastic pipes and plastic components are truly a central way to manage that risk and mitigate a very high % of likely damage that occurs in seismic events. A rigid system, as you just intuitively we all know, is far, far more prone and will experience far more failures. So when we come back, we have telegraphed the replacement in kind with plastics, largely thinking about that issue, but we do plan to do additional work and bring back additional information on that issue.
Okay, we'll go on to public comment and questions here. So if you want to speak, you can talk to Julie up by the door and fill out one of these yellow cards. We'll start with Carol Ellen, followed by John Stratton.
You've stated my name. It is Carol Ellen. First, I want to thank you for all your work you've done.
Please use the microphone.
Thank you very much.
It's going to come up to you.
Yeah, thank you very much for all the work you've done so far. And I say so far. Now I'm baffled at what I should even ask at this juncture. Let's deal with the individual homeowner, me.
Use the mic.
Me, I'm individual homeowner, have a land, property that cannot be used right now because of water. I'm in the advisory zone. Yay. I've only received one letter stating any kind of information. It was not directed to me personally. We have not received any information regarding our situation. We have spent over $60,000 at this juncture with architectural fees and all the other fees that go with it. We are ready to start building in May. Now what do? Where does our water come from? My neighbor directly across the street from us was tested negative. Can we tap into his main? Can we have tanks, water tanks? And I guess the idea of having a well might be nixed at this juncture. I don't know what to do. We're still paying property taxes on our land that we cannot use. I know you can't answer me today, but I'd like to see a hand of who is going to answer me. Who's going to answer my question or my questions? No, you are the city council who makes the decision. Who's going to answer my question? Can you answer my question, or can we have a tank?
Ma'am, as I said, we can't get into a back and forth here.
Okay, fine, but then who might answer me?
It's actually, I want to just explain, it's part of the Brown Act is we don't get into conversations here. It's a state law. What I will ask is make sure that there's a member of the staff, and somebody raise your hand, please, where folks can give their contact information. Make sure that they have contact with the city and we have your proper address and ways to get in touch with you in the future. We don't have all the answers to the questions that you're asking right now, and I said that up front. We are working on getting those answers, and we will get them. It may not be today.
You will, okay, you can't answer my question, then I'll ask. When will we get them? When can we move forward and know that at the end of the day, when the contractor hands us a key, we can move into our house? I'm 70 years old. My wife is 76. Our age is pushing. You know, we'd like to enjoy the house at some juncture, sooner than later.
I understand.
You understand. May I? Okay, I can't ask you any questions. That's it.
Thank you. John Stratton, he'll be followed by Dennis Parsons.
Hi, I'm John Stratton. I'm in the advisory zone also. And a couple of things that were brought up that would be, first of all, the question about the 2 years as an aggressive schedule. Is that the first house or is that the last house?
And we'll get these questions answered. The questions we can answer, we will get answered
Okay,
at
well,
the end
he
of the
had
public
the estimate,
comment.
so that should be an answerable question.
We will get those answers at the end of the public comment.
Okay, the second one is they talked about sequencing of the neighborhoods, which is a great idea. I don't see why we can't do the parallel of the neighborhoods. That's a question for back here. But if we're going to do sequencing of neighborhoods, will it be published? It needs to be published because we're going to have contractors potentially coming into the neighborhoods to build, and if we don't know the sequences, it's impossible to schedule. As was mentioned earlier, it sounds like we just got a letter sent out for the contamination for the residents of the 350 properties just this last week. I've never received avenues, and like me, like the previous homeowner or landowner, we've spent a lot of money on architectural fees that we were assuming, based on previous conversations, that says worst case scenario from some of the folks behind us, it would be 1 year to replace the entire system during public meetings, and we planned accordingly. Now it's 2 years. Or as the best case scenario. It seems unreasonable that we're constantly getting a moving target when we're trying to plan for our lives. And there was a question is we don't know about the construction. Well, based on what I hear today, you're not going to have a whole lot of it because the people are not going to be rebuilding because we have no guarantee that we have an opportunity to rebuild and stay in the area. We were committed to rebuild last week. What I see here today, it might be the commitment is to move out of state. And I'm pretty sure I'm not the only one that's thinking that. Because within 2 years, our insurance is going to run out. Is the city going to pay for that now, since you're delaying the rebuilding of the water system? I'm pretty sure that an additional 2 years or more to rebuild the house is not in a lot of people's best interest. That's going to be a big challenge for a lot of the folks up in this contaminated area. Not everybody in the contaminated area is under the advisory. Keysite's right in the middle of it. They don't have a water problem. Why aren't we able to use some of the water systems that they're hooked up to?
We'll get your answers.
Thank you.
Dennis Parsons, followed by Patrick Harrison.
Yeah, hi, I'm Dennis Parsons up here. I used to live on Fir Ridge Drive, so I'm directly affected by this. I've got a comment and 2 questions. My first comment echoes what's already been said. The 2-year timeline you've introduced, I think, is almost a non-starter given the timelines of home rebuilding. Homeowners have an insurance clock ticking as we speak that is basically 18 months from finishing. So 2 years minimum is just not going to work. And I would hope that you are able to develop solutions that can be implemented in months rather than years. So my question is, why aren't you allowing homeowners to install filtration systems on their side of the water meter to control this contamination? That would solve the benzene issue almost immediately. And it's not a new technology, it exists already. So the comment, you need to have a better timeline. The question is, why aren't you looking at other solutions that the homeowner can implement? Thank you.
Thank you. Patrick Harrison, followed by James Sickles. Is Patrick Harrison here? James Sickles? Mr. Sickles will be followed by Shelley Browning.
Yes. First, I wanted to say, as a retired environmental investigator, I am impressed by the quality of the work that's gone into this. But one thing I was asking, having used the interactive GIS map, we actually were outside of the advisory area. But the samples that are posted, there's only a couple in that area. Are those maps up to date? And if we have a lot and it doesn't have a sample posted by it, I know earlier they were saying they would hope to have all the lots sampled, and I was wondering what the approximate time frame was for that estimated completion. Thank you.
Thank you. Shelley Browning, followed by Philip Beard.
Should I do an overhead? Okay. Thank you. I read the newspaper article about this and the $43 million the paper stated was going to be estimated need to rebuild this. And as the council knows, I've been advocating for a public bank of Santa Rosa for several years. So I just wanted to speak to how the state of North Dakota, the Bank of North Dakota, reacted to a disaster that occurred in the city of Grand Forks, North Dakota in 1997. The city, of population of 50,000, was decimated by flood and fire and almost completely wiped out the entire city. So the Bank of North Dakota put in a 6-month moratorium on any mortgages or student loans that were financed through the bank and put no interest or payments for 6 months. They established a relief fund within 2 weeks, a disaster relief fund, and they allotted $5 million to assist flood victims and $70 million line of credit. That $70 million, there's the breakdown of how it was spent. 15 on emergency management, 10 National Guard, 25 direct to the city of Grand Forks, 12 million to the university, and then 7 to raise the height of a dike. The breakdown of the numbers, if you were to look at it in today's dollars, that 70 million would have been, is equivalent to $2,135 in credit per capita to government agencies immediately after the fire.
This would be $25 million line of credit, or the $25 million line of credit for the City of Grand Forks is the equivalent of Santa Rosa obtaining a $134 million line of credit today. So just to break that down, again, if we were using our own tax dollars in our own bank, we could use that credit to finance some of the needs that we're having today. Thank you.
Philip Beard, followed by Thomas Ells.
Hi, I'm Philip Beard. Thanks for the opportunity to address you on this issue. I just want to underscore the point that Shelley just made about the urgency for moving as quickly as we can towards the establishment of a public bank for Santa Rosa. We have to understand, as many people have pointed out, that we're in a situation that is unprecedented. We are designing the template as we go. In other words, we're existing outside the box already. That being the case, we certainly can't afford to continue to look for financing tools that are within the old box. Raising taxes is a non-starter. Cutting programs that are already suffering is a stupid answer. And selling bonds, in other words, taking out loans that will saddle us with increased interest payments to the institutions that lend the money, is also not going to meet our needs. So we have to look beyond those conventional means of securing financing. Now, the nice thing about public banking is that we've got a track record. We're not reinventing the wheel here. We've got the Bank of North Dakota. Shelley just pointed out some rather impressive statistics about how they dealt with a huge natural disaster that hit the town of Grand Forks in 1995, I think it was. There are other examples. The Sparkassen system in Germany is a system of public-private banks or credit unions that can tap their own resources without having to pay interest in order to meet public needs. So the time has definitely come for us to recognize the urgency of moving beyond conventional systems of financing and looking towards responsible, creative ways of providing us with the money that we need. The money is the big issue here, and I know it's at the back at least, maybe at the front of everyone's mind. How in God's name are we going to afford all the costs for the rebuilding that needs to be done and all of the other problems that the city is perennially faced with? Public budgets all over the country are underfunded. That will continue if we don't come up with a creative new way of providing for our needs. So I am told that CFO Alan Alton has set some money aside, I'm not sure how much, and I would appreciate finding that out, for a feasibility study for a public bank of Santa Rosa. And I appreciate that step forward very much. And I just want to reemphasize, in case you didn't already agree with me about it, the absolute urgency of looking for a solution along these public banking lines. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thomas Ells, and he'll be followed by Philip DiCarlo.
Well, it was a fascinating presentation on the research. Many problems occur with water lines. There are many things inside of water lines, as Flint, Michigan found out. Looking at these water lines, it doesn't look like there's much in there, some soot. To go back a little bit, I was an anthropologist and physicist and left high energy physics where I did studies of radiocarbon dating and potassium argon dating and things like that. I left physics and went into engineering and graduated from University of California, Irvine in 1983. And I was in civil engineering and environmental engineering. And we had the National Health Effects Laboratory there, which did these tests. and also groundwater created the water laboratory. It's Water Factory 21 that does the groundwater injection in Orange County to makes an aquitard there against the seawater and many, many things. 1986, I earned my registration as a civil engineer and also took a graduate certificate in hazardous materials management, and also produced NPDES permits for TCE, trichloroethylene, and did sampling with regard to water contamination in local mutual water companies. I would recommend you flush the system extensively. Use activated charcoal filtration on the homes. There's only 13 homes right now. Doesn't cost $43 million to do that. Pugging the pipes, scrubbing them extensively, using video camera systems, using like in sewer systems, and a parcel tax and a benefit assessment district to replace this, because it's really not a universal cost to the whole community. Shouldn't be put as a burden on the full water system. Right now, these contamination levels at most of the places, so you could do selectively replacing the mains in those areas that have high contamination, those areas that have, I noticed that on the sampling there were many areas that had 10 parts per billion, and that would be about 30 thousandths of a gram per 1,000 gallons. 30 thousandths of a gram per, that's the 10 parts per billion. Again, 30 thousandths of a gram per 10,000 or per 1,000 gallons of water that could easily be filtered out with activated charcoal filtration and things like that. So, and then pugging and flushing and doing these things for a long period of time.
Thank you. Philip DiCarlo, followed by Bob Hanson.
Good afternoon, everyone. One question. So I'm a property owner in Fountain Grove. I'm leading the effort for our entire subdivision to rebuild. We have 40 homeowners that have banded together, and we are actually a matter of 2 to 3 days away from signing a contract with one of Northern California's largest builders to rebuild the entire subdivision. The question on everybody's mind is, can we rebuild concurrent with the water project? Basic question. I'm not sure that's been addressed. If I heard the panel correctly, they seem to imply, I don't want to put words in their mouth, or perhaps I misunderstood it. The answer to that is yes, if you're, and perhaps it's a different answer if you're in the zone or outside the zone. So to whatever extent we can get guidance at this point, or whenever we can get guidance, that's the number one question on everybody's mind. Our subdivision is immediately outside of the green zone. It's actually directly adjacent to the green zone. Most of Fountain Grove, I think, is outside of that green zone. So the question is, will we be allowed to rebuild while the water project is going on? Thank you.
Thank you. We'll get that answered. Bob Hanson, followed by Natalie Constantino Manning.
Good afternoon, everybody. Bob Hanson, registered voter of Santa Rosa. I see multiple layers of study, investigation, federal, state, and local. Yet at the same time, 2 weeks ago, our city approved a $137,000 contract to spray 2 of our city water retention dams for weed abatement. That means Roundup. That's a listed carcinogen. 3 weeks before that, a similar dollar amount to spray pesticides in our city. Does anybody else see the craziness of this? Study after study on contaminants that the EPA stopped cleanup for the first 6 weeks after the fire until the rains came. Now all those contaminants are in our water study. A lot of people making a lot of money off 2,800 families who lost their homes. And at the same time, our city is paying to spray Roundup on our city dams. paying to spray pesticides in our city. It's got to stop. It's got to stop somewhere. Thank you.
Natalie Constantino Manning.
I need to pause. Did you hear me? Okay, hi. 1908 Lion Court, Fountain Grove, within the affected area. And I appreciate very much the City of Santa Rosa, the Water Department. They've been actually very open in speaking with me in particular, and they've come out to many of our community meetings, and so I really appreciate that. And the presentation this afternoon was very clear, and that's a great thing. That's a very difficult subject to talk about, and so that was all very clear, and we appreciate all the investigative work they've been doing. I guess to mimic some of the other comments, definitely the timeline needs to really be explicit. We hear 2 years, but that doesn't include some of the. It wasn't clear whether there was going to be a no bid or bid process. I'm recommending, and I hope that you go for no bid process to expedite. Also, as you heard, many of us are on a 2-year limit, which already started back in November of 2017. So we're going to be tight getting up to our insurance. And so I'm hoping that the City Council, along with the Board of Supervisors and many of the other powerful people in this community, would be able to help assist in forcing the state insurance commissioner to push a little bit harder on our insurance companies to extend that 2-year additional living expense, because as I can see it, we're definitely going to be needing that. So those are my recommendations. So definitely I'd love to see an expedited timeline and sent that out to folks, because as you heard, many people are kind of on the fence as to what to do. We're still in the architect conceptual design process, but that doesn't mean that we could look to buying another property or doing something else. So we kind of need to know those answers fairly soon. So I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Jan Verspecht, followed by Rosemary Yates.
Hi there. So we've heard a lot of bad news. I'd like to bring a positive note. I live in the advisory area. I live in one of the 13 homes. I got all of the water issues, and I actually was able to brew some award-winning beer at the California State Fair. So I actually have a solution on the demand side. So first of all, I want to say that the people of the water department did a great job. They're all great people. They helped us during these difficult times. And they have a hard time to get clear water delivered to the homes. From the home itself, from the homeowners, there is actually a very feasible solution that costs $5,000. I looked into the data and I installed water filters, active carbon water filters. There are two things about this big, and they solve the problem. So I'm an engineer myself. I did the calculations. For the highest levels of benzene that have been found, these filters take it out, because that's the good thing. Active carbon absorbs the benzene very, very well. So the main issue that caused the problem, as I understood, is the carbon inside the water pipes. It absorbs the carbon. Can be used to our advantage in the active carbon filter that we put actually at our point of entry. So in our house, we live there and use the water as we did before. And actually, I can guarantee that the water that we drink is the purest that any Santa Rosian actually can drink in this area. And so if you go budgeting, that would be like $2 million. If every of the houses install such a filter, from the people that live in the houses, there's no problem. And so I just wanted to mention that there is hope, and I hope this piece of information or this solution could help in the rebuilding process. And I don't know what to do with it. It's hard for the people, because apparently there are legal issues there. But I want just to say to especially the homeowners, that they can install such a filter and have clean water. And it was installed in 1 day. You write a $5,000 check, and you're okay. And that's all I wanted to say. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Rosemary Yates.
Hi there.
And she'll be followed by Rebecca O'Connell.
Hi there, I'm Rosemary Yates. I have a comment and question as a builder. I represent a custom home builder in Santa Rosa that is rebuilding in Fountain Grove, both in the affected area and in the unaffected area. So concerns that this brings up in hearing the plan, I see a need for additional logistics outside of this plan should it go forward with replacing the existing water lines. And that is that if we, how we would get construction, water for construction, maybe, or other sources serviced by the city of Santa Rosa Water. Thinking about if we build a home in that area and take the homeowner's money and go to completion, we would want to guarantee, as with the homeowner, that that homeowner can take occupancy whether or not the new mains are in place. So is there a temporary water service that could be established so that those homes, regardless of this 2 or more year plan, so that we could make sure that people can get into their new homes? Otherwise, as a contractor, we would be liable to start building if there was no mandate that the occupancy could be taken on. Also, for those, I live outside. I'm a fire survivor myself. I live outside and the area, and I'm rebuilding my home. I have approximately 250 feet of PVC pipe from the meter to my home. I can personally get that tested, but I'm wondering if there's an opportunity for the city to test my home line so that I can understand if that will need replacing. I do have water on my property at this time through the city of Santa Rosa. I'm in the unaffected area. Thank you.
Thank you. Rebecca O'Connell, followed by Scott Adams.
Hello. My husband and I lost our home on Windermere Circle in the fire, and that is within the affected area. So my question would be, you say that it's going to take 2 years to make the improvements needed. Does that 2 years start now, or does the 2 years start at some point in the future? So I'm just asking that you make that information, along with all the other questions that have been asked, available to all the residents in that area, so that we can make informed decisions as to how we are going to move forward with either rebuilding on our existing lots, or purchasing another lot somewhere else, or buying a home. Thank you.
Thank you. Scott Adams.
My name is Scott Adams. We had a lot on Longleaf Court, and I'd like to personalize a little bit so the council can understand who you're talking with. I'm not a wealthy person. I've worked hard since I was a teenager. I saved up some money, and 9 months before the fire, we bought our house. I've been on my lot since almost day one, cleaning it myself with the help of a contractor, and I intend to build my house along with the contractor when I can. About a month ago, we were at a meeting, and the water director said that worst case scenario would take about a year. So I have been planning accordingly since that time, about 6 weeks ago, that it was going to be a year. Now it's going to be 2 years, maybe, kind of, sort of, and it's a moving target. And that's just unacceptable. We're living in an 800 square foot apartment on Santa Rosa Avenue, and I can tell you we're not happy campers. My insurance money is going to run out, and I can tell you that all the people that left behind me when I was sitting down here before public comment, they're not going to rebuild. All those people, I can speak for them. 2 years is too long to be out of a house. We don't have any housing to find here. My wife and I have been looking since day one to move into a more acceptable type of a house, more than an 800 square foot apartment, and we can't find it unless we go somewhere else. Windsor, Healdsburg, San Rafael, and I can't do that because I have a disabled daughter and take care of her children every day. So that's personal, and I'd like all of you to keep that in mind when you're thinking about what needs to be done to think about me. Thank you.
Thank you. That's all the cards I have. Mr. Adams, I can I'll speak for myself, but I think I can speak for everybody up here that we know this is personal. We know that 2 years is too long. As you can see, the time estimates here are moving target, and they will continue to be. I can pretty much guarantee that. And I would keep that in mind as you're talking to your contractors too, because it's estimates are estimates. The city council, the city staff, everybody who works for this organization wants to get people back in their homes as fast as possible. And we will do that. But what's possible is not even known right now. I don't want to call what we just heard a plan because it's not fully formed yet. We don't have all the answers, as I said at the beginning of this. So before we get to council questions, I'm going to try and capture some of the questions that were asked here. And I'm not going to get probably to all the questions either, but we'll go through what we can today. So the first one is on the 2-year estimate. Is that an estimate of the first house hooked up or the last?
That would be the last house hooked up. So there would be several hundred people hooked up before the last house is hooked up.
And the sequencing question was brought up, and when you were talking about sequencing neighborhoods, I mean, I can't even imagine what the process will be for deciding who's first and who's last. I'm assuming that there will be a good engineering reason for that, and I hope there is, because I wouldn't want it to be based on other things. But how will that be decided, and what's your estimate on when that sequencing will be known?
I would just like to mention that just before coming down here today, our engineering firm that is working on this sequencing for us submitted another analysis for our consideration. We will, I assume, be looking at that very closely and doing a risk-benefit analysis and bringing those recommendations potentially forward sometime very soon. That would be our goal. The sooner the better.
And when we're talking about very soon, we're talking in government terms. So are we talking about weeks, months?
I wanted to note the 2 years. It is, I think, is maybe what you may be feeling from the presentation. Today is premature to have brought a time frame to you, yet we knew there was interest and we knew there was a demand to hear some timing. It was not fair for me to ask Ms. Urbanik to come up with a time at this point because there is so much work being done. And as in my hopeful caveated 1-year comment I said earlier, we do understand that decisions get made and there's not clarity when we talk about an early estimate of timing and what we hope it would be. And what Ms. Urbanik really means is best case scenario, given all the inherent complications that we know will arise in a project of this size. So I just wanted to note that. In terms of coming back here with clarity and specificity on so much related to the rebuild, I would like to think in a 6 to 8 week time period, we'll be back here with details in terms of the alternative constructability approaches and why we're recommending a certain one, what that means in terms of a specific time frame, and hopefully some of the specific sequencing that would move forward under that approach. And we'll continue to try and be clear in terms of our level of confidence of the numbers we're bringing, and I hope I was clear on the 2 years. And so we'll shoot for a time frame around that, which will be very aggressive for us in the work we need to do.
So, Mr. Hornstein, I understand that it may be 6 to 8 weeks before we have a more detailed plan here, but I hope that we can get some updates in the meantime.
Yes, well, we will provide continuous updates under the fire response item on council meetings.
Thank you. So I'm going to go down this list. There were a few comments about filtration on the home side of the system. I understand that our job in Santa Rosa is to provide clean, drinkable water in our system. But while we're working on that over the next 2 years, however long that is, can people continue to receive water and filter it themselves? Can the existing contaminated system remain in place while we're building the new system? Is that even a feasibility at this point? And finally, I think related to that same thing is, can folks get an occupancy permit on a new home without a new water line?
There are, as you are indicating, a number of questions related to the at-home activated carbon or similar treatment system to help address the timing. Some of this is working with our regulators. The benefit of a municipal supply that's treated and monitored with professionals is significant in terms of a regulator perspective and confidence on the quality of water at each home. The questions include the 13 homes. If you heard, there's a number of them that are proceeding with this system. They are still under the advisory. They're making their own personal informed decision on the sort of treatment system, its efficacy. It does seem very thoughtful, but nonetheless, they're to some extent on their own deviating from the regulatory imposed water quality advisory that's underway for that area. Some of the other things that we will all need to think about in terms of these questions is some of the concentrations that were found in the area are not just chronic long-term exposure concerns. They are, in some levels, in some areas, short-term, more acute issues. And we do need to think about balancing the interests of folks moving forward and, for example, having availability of water for construction activities and for homes, and what that means for the city's responsibilities we have in terms of ensuring that folks are safe in the use of this water with our partnered regulators. A long way of saying what we understand it is becoming a central issue, and we are working on that to try and understand the parameters. It does feel like there's some opportunity there, and I'm not suggesting we're going to come back and say there's no way any of this could work. I'm just reflecting there are complexities in terms of cities' responsibilities, liabilities, and how our partner regulators may see some of these scenarios.
It may not be up to the city or the city council as to whether any more homes could be hooked up to a contaminated system. Is that what you're saying?
I think we'll be certainly influenced by the regulators, and perhaps more than that. I don't know they're going to come down with dictates, but in some cases they may very well.
Okay. I missed a question earlier. The question about construction of new homes happened concurrently with the construction of a new system.
That question, there's one that we do have clarity of a response, and that's a specific question in regards to rebuilding outside of the advisory area. And all of these issues have nothing to do with rebuilding outside the advisory area, and folks can proceed in accordance with the current permitting process that's been laid out and they've been informed about.
What about inside the advisory area?
I think, it's not what I think, but that there are a number of very complicating issues, and it feels important to staff that we understand so you can benefit from information from us what the implication of different decisions would be. For example, if open-ended opportunities were of everyone can go and start rebuilding and we'll somehow find water, and the public works project will be from the potential impacts that will interface between all the private rebuilding and this public works project. Were that approach to greatly extend the time of completing this work, and it's not unlikely that to be the case, we would want to bring that back to council to get direction and input from you on how to handle some of these issues that will require some measure of balancing individuals and the entirety of this project to get it done as quick as possible.
So for the people in this room who are on the cusp of making a decision to hire a contractor, to sign a contract, those folks who live in the contaminated area, is the message that we don't know if they'll be able to start construction before there's water replaced to their properties?
I think the message is the timing is an important part of your consideration in terms of being able to occupy your house when your construction is complete. I think it's prudent to let a bit of time go by so you can have confidence from hearing from us in terms of what that collective timing may look like, or are we able to work with some of those on-site treatment systems and allow folks to have the opportunity to move in with some sort of system like that. Today, there is nothing that I'm aware of that is preventing folks in this area to get their permit to begin the rebuild process. There are some questions and concerns in terms of you do need water in a number of ways during construction activities, and will the city be able to provide water for those construction activities in the time frame that folks may need it?
And that, as Ms. Urbanik said, is under review right now. Is that correct?
Yes.
So there was a question about, are the GIS maps that are online up to date?
Yes, so as was mentioned in the presentation, we're taking approximately 175 samples a day, and that overwhelms the capacity of our lab. So we have 3 other labs on board doing samples. So it does take some time. So it's approximately a week to 2 weeks before those results are known and incorporated into our systems and updated. Additionally, just for clarification, I had mentioned earlier that that map is the most recent data, and so that's what's being provided as those results come in.
And are dates on each
Correct.
site?
So if you click on it, you'll see the date as well as the actual result.
Thank you. So there was a question about doing this project as a no-bid project. I don't think that's what I heard you say. I think that there's a question about whether it can be a design-build process. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Maybe you could explain what that is.
There's a couple of things, and I would probably want to refer to our legal department on some of these answers, but the no bid is probably not what was meant, and to be eligible for reimbursement and to comply with state contracting code, that is not an option for us. But what is an option for us is to take advantage of a design build where it's a more cooperative arrangement with the contractor, the owner, and the designer to expedite the construction schedule. It also reduces what I would call the low bid problems that we often see in public contracts, where oftentimes, not oftentimes, but occasionally we would get a contractor who may not perform as well as the next highest bid, potentially. And I understand that there's a lot of different things that can complicate the way a construction project can proceed, which is why we would want to ensure that whatever contractor that the city ends up contracting with is a qualified underground contractor. I think that is key in this situation. We do have an ordinance that allows us to do a design build project. We haven't undertaken a design build project of this magnitude. There is some time that it would take us to get the administrative end of that taken care of. I've done a preliminary analysis, and that looks like the administrative part could take about 3 months. I have on Thursday a meeting set up with some local experts in the larger Bay Area to discuss some of the options on how we could advance using this contracting mechanism. There are templates that are available that could aid us in advancing a design build situation. And again, this is just now, hitting my desk and running as fast as we can to provide as much information that is not over-promising at this point. But we are actively looking for every potential way possible to advance this project, give real expectations to folks in the community, and to maintain our eligibility with FEMA reimbursement. So there's a lot of moving pieces for us, and we're working as hard as we possibly can to advance this project.
Okay, thank you. There was a question about extending the 2-year insurance deadline, and I'll answer this. That's not something that we can do here. There is legislation right now in Sacramento in the legislature, I think that was put forward by Senator McGuire, to extend it to 3 years. I have personally, and it would be retroactive. So that would, if you like that idea, let Senator McGuire know. I've personally written a letter to State Farm on behalf of some residents who have State Farm insurance, who banded together and asked State Farm for some flexibility in their rules as far as insurance. I would be happy to do that for other folks as well in this situation, but it's not up to the City Council what insurance companies do. We can use whatever influence we have, but it's more about public relations at that point. I think you answered the question about water for construction. There was also a question about testing outside of the contaminated zone, testing on request. Is that something that we do?
So I think if I understand the question correctly, it was, are we going to be testing every single service line within the burned area? The answer is yes, we are doing that. and the time frame on when that would be complete. We should be finishing those activities up by next week. So we will have every single service line within the burned area tested, including existing homes or service lines to destroyed properties.
And if someone is curious as to whether their line has been tested yet, they can look on that GIS.
They can look on the GIS map. If they can't find that information, they can contact us directly. But we are going to be testing everything within 500 feet of a destroyed, something that was affected by the fire. So all will be done.
Thank you.
There are limits, just from a shared resource standpoint, to respond to every interest of testing. In homes on private properties, I believe there was a question regarding a property that was not burned, but interest to have that tested. What we're trying to focus on this issue broadly to move this project forward. So at this point, we can't be promising that we can accommodate every personal interest for testing and analysis that's out there. But we can, and I don't know that we've done this necessarily, but it would make sense for us to share in some fashion certified labs and where folks can access that information to pursue some private testing if they're interested to supplement what they're seeing for us for now.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to go to questions from the board and the council, and I'm going to turn the mic over to Mr. Galvin.
Vice Chair Arnone.
Kind of as an example of the moving target nature of this, you commented that we're trying to preserve our right to receive funding from FEMA, and there's been a question about whether we were eligible for funding in the first place, but then also eligibility for expedited funding was also an issue. And I know there's been an evolution of FEMA's response to our request for expedited funding. Could you kind of go through that history of what we were told by FEMA in the beginning and what we're being told now?
Early on in this process, we had understood that there was a path for a project like this to receive expedited funding, which is a specific regulatory provision within FEMA. It turns out that does not apply for the category that this project is in, which is permanent repair. We continue to work very closely with FEMA on, even though there's not a defined path for expedited funding, what would we as the city need to do to get expedited funding, meaning work very closely with FEMA, work through the process. If it needs to be reviewed in DC, maybe we'd send someone there to walk through, just going through everything we can. And at this point, I'd say the notion of us getting funding in advance of construction moving forward is hopeful. So I think we can hope and do everything possible to obtain that, to help with the cash flow and not completely deplete reserves that has a feeling of vulnerability to it, yet plan for a funding mechanism without the early FEMA funding and ensure everything we're doing is subject to reimbursement, which is the more traditional FEMA path.
Members of the council, questions? Mr. Tibbetts.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So I think one of the questions that I still have outstanding speaks to what a lot of the people in the audience asked, and that was kind of, do we have a plan to provide water to the 13 existing homes that currently stand up there, and as well as homes that come online through the construction process? And in looking at this map, one of the questions I guess that I have is, does the main serving this section of Fountain Grove run up Fountain Grove Parkway? And second, identifying where the main is, where it's clean, is there a reason why we couldn't, I mean, I'm sorry to be crude, but putting fire hoses or some kind of temporary above surface temporary water lines up to some of these homes. Is that a possibility? Has that been discussed?
So thank you, Councilmember Tibbetts. Yes, we've considered all options, working with the team as well as our experts, as well as our regulators to truly see what options could be for providing water. As Director Hornstein mentioned, we don't have a clear pathway yet. There are a number of risks that you have to consider. There is still cleaning activities that are taking place. As Deputy Director Urbanik mentioned earlier, one of the biggest issues is recontamination. So we're considering every option that we can within the water quality advisory area. As we presented earlier, we do know that that contamination has gotten not only into the service lines, but in the mains. So right now, that is the source for that water. In order to bring a new source in, it is a pretty heavy construction project. However, we're looking at every option that we can, and we do intend to bring whatever makes sense and is feasible, balancing those risks, balancing what the requirements are, and balancing what we have to do as a municipal water supplier back at some point, as Director Hornstein mentioned, in the coming weeks, as options that we can consider.
Thank you, Deputy Director Burke. Coming back, when you do come back, I'd be really curious to have a firm answer to that question, because I think it's on a lot of people's minds who live up in Fountain Grove. And so if there is an obstacle to it, whether it's financial or regulatory, we need to be able to articulate what that is. I'm a believer that you can find a source of the main that is clean when these new homes are rebuilt and the service lines are installed, that you can run it. I mean, it seems possible that you could run it directly to the service line with an above surface or above ground hose as a temporary solution. So being able to answer that question, I think would really be helpful for all of us. Another question that I had was the catastrophic reserve. Can you tell us how much is currently the catastrophic reserve?
I thought it was closer to 5.7 or 6 million. 5.7 million.
We have 5.7 in the catastrophic reserve. As I noted, we are working with the BPU committee to look at, we do have some untagged reserves, we do have operating reserves, and we do have the ability to pull from current capital projects. Collectively, it does seem that without FEMA early funding, we will be able to move forward with this project. It will be a eyes wide open in terms of where we stand in terms of our reserve.
Okay, thank you. Those are my only questions.
Yes, board member Watts.
Thank you. I had a question regarding the accelerating the design and construction process. It is mentioned on slide 40 to provide a separate water system to existing homes. So this is kind of off of Councilmember Tibbetts' question. What would that look like? Has that been discussed? And what's the timeline for that to get some of these homeowners that are doing some of the active carbon filtration and other things that the director said are a little bit out of our advisory mechanisms for filtration, to get them back into a water system where they would be regulated for clean water standards?
Okay, there's two parts to that. One during construction that we have specifically talked about is bringing tanks, separate water supply tanks to the 13 homes that are currently there. And I'll refer to Director Burke on the water quality issues. Yeah.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, we are looking at all options. There are certain restrictions and there are certain regulations and there are certain requirements. And so we are actively researching and working with our regulators to understand what those would be. There's also logistics that have to be considered as you're sort of dealing with those kind of options and looking at them. So absolutely considering all of those, we will bring specifics back when we bring this back.
And adding just a bit to that, it's the question will, in our analysis, will bring it in, will likely flow from, if you're doing it for 13, as folks are rebuilding, will you just do it to all these homes? And it starts to create a exceedingly complicated scenario of potentially hundreds of these individual systems in place that need maintenance, that need sampling, that need ongoing water supplies, all during this very massive public works project and all the rebuilding going on in the private rebuild. I have no idea where it's going to fall, and these comments are in no way suggestive that it's not going to be a viable path going forward. It's just it's going to take some time for us to work through all of it and bring back to you fairly what are the implications of one approach or another.
And I appreciate the homeowners going above and beyond to do research on this filtration device, but I would imagine that not everyone has the capability of a $5,000 out-of-pocket expense in order to ensure clean water. So I think a timeline around the separate water system would be, I think, really important for those 13 homeowners to see. And then my other question is regarding all of the investigation around the sources. Was there also investigation around why in this particular area the leaching happened as opposed to other areas of Fountain Grove or Coffee Park or other burned areas?
Yes, that has been a dominant question that we've had, and to some extent it continues, but where the investigation is pointing to now in terms of why this area, right? What we all know that Fountain Grove and Coffee Park all experienced comparable severe burns of residences that resulted in melted plastic and thus giving off these contaminants. In this area uniquely, the combination of supply and tremendous demand on the system resulted in pressure drop in water loss such that the contamination got into the mains. And in terms of the fix, that really is the distinction. The main contamination that is very difficult, these are 8-inch pipes, and it is a fair point, I think, that Councilman Tibbetts raised. Are all the mains equally contaminated? Can some be pulled from and others? It does start to get into additional complexities, which means extension of time to understand all these issues and be able to navigate every interest that's out there. But what we are confident at this point, really supported by the massive data set we're creating of the uniqueness in this area distinguished from the other areas, even those that were getting this very low % of hits on burned properties.
Thank you. Councilmember Combs.
Thank you. First, let me thank the residents who've come out and spoken to us and listened and made clear what your issues are. It's important for us to hear this from you and to remember who you are as individuals, that you each have had a tremendous loss, and to really recognize that this recovery phase is long, arduous, ongoing for each of you. It should be pointed out that each of our emails is online for all of us. If you need to reach out directly to us, please feel that you can do that. I didn't want folks to think that just because we couldn't make an answer today that you don't have an ongoing communication, and I think all of us feel that way. Please do write us, email us. We'll talk to you. I also want to thank staff. I went to engineering school, so I recognize the carefully crafted engineering answers, and that in a really complex situation, it's hard to give that kind of sort of maybe clearer, definitive answer when there isn't one. It's a complex problem. So I want to thank you for trying so hard and working so hard to be as clear and to come back with as much information as you can with a problem that I've never heard of before. I'm not aware of any other area that has had a fire that's had this problem. So this is new ground for all of us, and I appreciate your taking the time to fully understand it and to bring back some of the best or most innovative responses that you can. Thank you for that. I have a couple of sort of in-the-weed questions, if you don't mind. We're using benzene as an indicator for the post-fire contamination. There were other things involved in the testing, other elements that we found than other things than benzene, constituent contaminants. Are they correlated? In other words, is there any constituent contaminant that isn't strongly correlated to benzene, that if we clear the benzene, are we sure we've gotten it? You understand what I'm asking? Is could there be two problems instead of one?
Right, and there are a multitude of compounds that when plastic is burned is giving off, and part of our confidence that, for example, this is not a petroleum spill contamination issue is the fingerprint of the analysis is very consistent with plastic melting and off-gassing than it is with any sort of fuel spill or similar issue. How we have looked at this with the regulators is as these other constituents emerge, which is not unusual in a water system even absent this issue, detection levels are so low, 1 part per billion, we're looking at molecules almost. And so you find almost anything you're looking for when you look at water at very trace concentration. So what's been leading our investigation and confidence in terms of assuring public health has been always ensuring, as we see these other numbers, that the advisories that are put into place because of benzene still trump any other concerns on the other constituents.
Okay, thank you. Without putting a stamp of approval on any system at all, are the filtration systems that have generally been discussed capable of managing not only the benzene but the other constituents? If someone, I mean, I appreciate you, I'm asking you to make a statement that may be more broad than you're comfortable with.
I'd say generally, activated carbon is a very robust means of removing organic chemicals from the liquid or the air phase. So what they're doing without our advice, without our guidance, and really at their own risk, yes. Seems to hold together, but I'm assuming that they're well-informed and taking advice of professionals, including public health experts.
Is there a list of constituents, so if an individual does their own research and checks their own filtration system, that they can compare? And I'm not saying that the system works, I'm saying, is there a list of constituents posted?
Yes, we do have the means to provide that information.
Okay, so individuals can handle that themselves and we don't need to make a statement about it.
Yes, and I would be very cautious that we're not giving any advice to property owners on this subject. There are too many factors that can go into placing that system in your home, how it's placed, how it's monitored, how it's maintained, so forth. So I would be making it clear that we're not giving any advice on that topic, and certainly not in this setting.
Thank you. I had another one, hold on. I know there's another one here, just a minute. As we move forward with the future improvements in the system, if we're doing design build based on existing plans, does that leave the opportunity to do improvements to the fire equipment?
Yes, it does.
Okay. And I hope, from my own opinion, I hope that there is some possibility to put some flexibility into a system that is not PVC, and hope that we can pursue that. I don't know. It concerns me to put PVC back in. I hear this seismic issues. Moving on to cost-related questions. FEMA will pay some percentage sometimes. Is this the kind of thing that would be covered in the 90 to 10% FEMA? What do we know about that for sure?
My understanding is that the city manager is having discussions with FEMA to explore, to encourage consideration and understanding what it would take to do that. As it stands now, it's the 75%, 25%, assuming that your project is deemed eligible and all the I's are dotted, which we're, of course, trying to ensure. We have not yet got confirmation that the project is an eligible project. It is unique to FEMA. The fire station that burned down is not unique to FEMA. They can go out, they can see it. There's no question there was a fire station there before. It burned down clearly because of the fire. They have photos of what it looked like prior, what it looks like now. So they can go through their very detailed process, very detailed, and have confidence to say this is an eligible project. So even that threshold determination has not been made, and we have a fair amount of work ahead of us to ensure that it does. It is found to be an eligible project, and we're subject to reimbursement along those lines.
And I would just emphasize that that's all subject to discussions right now. There's no final determinations, and we'll do our best.
If it were to cost about $40 million and it was the 75-25, then we're talking about a fourth of $40 million that would be our responsibility. That's about $10 million.
There is, even within the 25, there's a state match to that. So the actual, as I understand it, someone could correct me if I get it wrong, but the costs borne by our ratepayers are in the 6 to 7%, I believe.
Okay. Is there a reason that all of the ratepayers would share in these costs, such as 2A, and why all of the ratepayers would share in these costs?
I'd say ultimately, I don't believe there's a 218 issue there. I believe it's more of a policy determination. Generally, within our enterprises, we don't look at parceling out costs and expenses based on neighborhoods or areas. So it would not be consistent with our historical, within the water department. I'm sorry, I meant the water and sewer enterprise.
Right.
Other
programs do that. That's why I'm interested in So there's not a reason why, a legal reason why water would not do that. It's a policy decision that we make.
I believe that. I'm sure right now Ms. Dillon, not Molly, is thinking about that, and will be something that we would look at.
That coming forward,
yes.
Just to understand what the requirements are.
Yes.
Are there any wells affected? Have we got wells in the area? Are we testing wells? Is there anything related to wells in the area?
Within the water quality advisory area, the city's municipal, we don't have any wells in that area. Whether or not there are private wells in the area, I don't have that information. However, if folks do, they would be private wells, and they would be encouraged to just make sure that there isn't any kind of contamination issue in those wells.
So a private person with a private well should have their well tested privately?
Yes, correct.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to ask those questions.
Any other board member questions? Okay.
Mr. Vice Mayor.
All right, thank you. So I understand the need for us to be very careful and deliberate with our words, but I'd hate for anybody to leave here thinking we either didn't answer a question or they didn't understand the answer. So what I heard, and please confirm for me if this is accurate, is that we have now identified what the problem is. We've identified what we think a fix could be, but it's going to take us probably 6 to 8 weeks to actually figure out if that plan is viable. And then from that point forward, we think it's going to take 2 years to actually implement the plan. Is that correct?
I think 6 to 8 weeks will be the target for staff to bring back more details and more clarity, with the expectation of a recommendation on a fix and associated schedule. I believe, although Ms. Urbana can correct me, that the 2 years we're looking at as part of the construction effort. There is some time and preparatory work in terms of putting the bid together that, depending on the nature of the project delivery, meaning traditional design build or something else, could vary. We all know if it does turn out that it's a traditional bid process that has time built into it, for example.
So we're actually talking about longer then. So we're talking about 6 to 8 weeks plus the bid, and then plus 2 years for the construction?
No, the initial 2-year estimate, and again, I do want to say that we're looking at, that was one snapshot. And, but that time period included the administrative time to solicit bids, to award a bid, and for a contractor to start mobilization in the area and start through construction activities.
Okay. And I'm not sure I heard a clear answer on whether or not people can rebuild concurrent to us doing the work on the system. If I was a homeowner and I was trying to figure out whether or not I could begin the build process, is that acceptable?
Hi, David Kewen, Director of Planning and Economic Development. Good afternoon, Council and board members. We are currently working with individuals right now. We do have the ability to allow people to submit permits and start their construction. What you did hear is that construction water might be an issue, and that's something we'll have to work through. But we are looking at from a policy decision, we can allow people to start the process of designing construction, and then we would hold the occupancy until there is a satisfactory water supply and fire requirement for that site.
So individuals could work on rebuilding their home, work within that 2-year insurance limit that they have, hopefully 3 years if the legislation goes through, and they'd be able to rebuild the home but might not be able to reoccupy it. That's what I'm hearing.
That's correct. Yeah, we would have to hold occupancy until there's an adequate water supply and fire protection for that site. Again, we would need to make sure it's very clear that if somebody does submit their building permit, they understand that there's this issue that has to be dealt with, and the time is being clarified.
So if I was a homeowner looking to do this, I would also want to make sure that there was a strong commitment from the city that we were actually going to replace the water system and that we are going to move forward so that there would be occupancy. And I just want to reiterate that that is what they're hearing from this council member, from the council, from the board, is that that's the commitment. But it sounds like there's going to be a little bit of a wing and a prayer in terms of the timeline.
Right, and the other thing is that we're doing is putting people in place to help with the management of all the contracting and work that's going to go on out there at Coffee Park and in Fountain Grove. There's going to be a lot of activity. So we're looking at putting people in place very quickly to manage concrete trucks and water supply trucks and construction activity that's going to happen over the next 2 years.
All right, and then I have a question about the backflow issue. If you could come back, Mr. Director. So my understanding is part of why this part of the system was more contaminated than other areas was the drop in the pressure, which allowed more backflow back through the system. Was this area required to have backflow systems in place that are certified yearly?
No, this area in particular did not have any requirements that necessitated a backflow, so wasn't needed in this area.
Okay. So we're not worried about if we rebuild the system, are we going to put those in, or are we looking at this as just a fluke?
As part of the rebuild, all new residences are required by state law to have fire sprinklers, fire suppression inside the facility. The city has always, in that case, to protect the water supply, required backflow preventers. So currently, the thinking is that may flow with the rebuild requirements. City staff is working on that issue as there's additional costs for backflow preventers, and some municipalities deal with this issue differently. As it stands now, fire suppression sprinklers are required, and currently associated backflow preventers will also be required for the new homes.
And what about the existing homes that aren't going through a full rebuild? The 13 that we heard about, some architecture work, but no other changes to it. Is there a way to build that into the system as well? Or is that a potential vulnerability?
At this point, and Director Goen may have some different information, but it's my understanding they don't have the requirement for the residential fire sprinklers. We are looking at if there are additional options, clearly understanding this backflow issue and drop in pressure, if there are other things that we can also look at that could help prevent something like that in the future.
Okay. Great, thank you so much.
Board Member Dowd.
I want to add this comment into the comments made by Director Horenstein and Director Goen. And as I envision this, the Community Development Department and the Water Department needs to be very, very clear about what their intentions are and what their process would be if a homeowner decided to start construction on their home. I also think we need to be very clear that homeowners need to check with their insurance companies and check with the mortgage holder on their property to be certain that those two entities are comfortable with the process being laid out by the City of Santa Rosa.
Other questions from council members? Ms. Combs.
Thank you. I have a kind of follow-up question. In the discussion of phasing, I'm trying to understand what sort of the key factors might be. Some of them are hydraulic and other engineering-related factors. Is one of the factors that you have to close the road so that people don't have access to their property during that period of work?
Road closure, we don't really anticipate or haven't anticipated needing road closures. I've spoken with our traffic engineer, Rob Sprinkle, about using some creative detours as we're doing pipeline construction on Fountain Grove. There is some availability to route traffic through some neighborhoods for a short duration for that type of work. We don't anticipate road closures. I think that what the property owners would experience is potentially a day or two of our work in front of their house, or they're rebuilding their house. And again, it's going to be a massive coordination issue. We've talked about having these coordinators, these staff be coordinators, so everyone knows in advance what's coming next. We know what's going to happen in the area should this project move forward. Folks that are also planning their activities, is my concrete going to be able to get in on my pour on Thursday, or are you going to be right in front of this location? So we're working to create a system to avoid those kind of complications in scheduling, and trying to get out ahead of that type of issue.
Thank you. I also just want to note that we have a house who have homes that they can't access because of certain conditions there. One of those, not all of them, but one of them also involves water. I'm hoping that anything that we plan to do to support folks in this area, we are also planning to do to support anyone who wants to return to their home in that area. I just want to make sure that we're not singling out any particular group for receiving these services.
Any other questions?
It's not on the agenda.
I told a woman I talked to on the phone today that I would ask this question. Fountain Grove resident whose home burned down, but her garden is still there. And she wonders if they put barrels out, whether we'll put water in them. So just another thing to think about. I don't need an answer right now, but she's probably not the only one who has plants surviving. Also, I want to make sure that we're clear on this, that right now, money is not what's holding things up. We are trying to formulate a plan for a significant project, and that's what's taking the time.
That's correct.
Thank you. I want to thank the folks for coming today. I know a lot of people have left already. This council, this organization, as I said before, the intent, the direction from the council, the will and the work of our employees is to get people back in their homes, to help you rebuild. I know that not all of the help that you are hoping for has been given tonight. We're trying to get the answers. We will keep working on this. And I guarantee you that the folks that you see in front of us tonight are working hard to help you get your homes rebuilt. We'll continue to do that. With that, I want to thank the Board of Public Utilities for joining us this afternoon. We're going to adjourn this meeting, and the City Council will be going into closed session. We're going to take just a 5-minute break here. here for our closed session. Please clear the room. We'll call the closed session to order. Please take your conversations outside. I have a couple of cards from people who want to comment on our public session, on our closed session. Mio Villagomez, followed by Scott Wagner.
Does this just go up like that? Just that easy. I'm back again to advocate on the behalf of the encampment and suggest using kindness and grace when thinking about those people there. There's a lot of concern expressed in this meeting about the water for the individuals that lost their homes, as there should be. If we can apply maybe 1/10 of that energy to the last chance encampment for these people, I think it would be showing some kindness and grace to them. We all know as parents, the people that are parents, I should say, know that actions have consequences for children. It's something I tried to emphasize with my own kids. And, in this setting, in a political setting, the same is true, especially with district elections coming up. So again, let's help the most disadvantaged among us. Thank you.
Scott Wagner.
Good afternoon. I'm a little stunned. It's been a rough couple of weeks. We're trying to get ready for a planned and announced eviction. We don't really see any difference between what's happening next week, starting on April 3rd, and what happened underneath the underpasses. And as you recall, and we certainly told you, we had a lot to do. So I'm not feeling all the way myself here, and I apologize for that. I'm going to give you 80% of Scott. Not getting a lot of sleep and trying to help people out with specific individual problems. Tom and Jenny Lynn did a great presentation. I think, at least I'll speak for myself, a lot of people didn't think it was great, but I liked a lot of pieces of it. And I appreciate some of what the consultant that they were using had to say. I've done a treatment here I'll give out to you. It's a couple of pages that delineates the problems that I see with the consultant's approach and the strengths of the consultant's approach. One part of the presentation that I really appreciated was going through the numbers of homelessness here. I don't have a good sense of the broad spectrum dimensions of homelessness because I'm really focused on people in the encampment. And as it came around to the encampments, it said that 13% of the 2,800 were homeless in encampments, and that amounted to 400 people. And that's what really clicked for me, is I realized that what I'm really focused on is those 400 people that we've got stuck at creeks and in riverbeds and elsewhere. And we are not providing, in our continuum of care, there's a big break there that I really want to address here, and that's why I'm here. Now, in the camp that we have, we've got 120 people there roughly. I think that probably 30 of them are not an adequate approach with the proposal that you have, that you hopefully will be discussing and taking seriously. This is not a superhuman effort to handle every human being out there, but my own experience is roughly 2/3 of the people there can go through an approval process and get into a planned, managed, sanctioned situation where they have the right to lay their head. This is a very, very simple point, and that's why I want to bring up that 400. We're talking about a very small amount that can make a huge, huge difference here, not only just from a standpoint of well-being for these people, but also get us out of your hair so you can work on things that are more important. These people have special problems, you know, and you are liable for their health, for their death, for the losses of the things. You are liable now. And we are going to do everything that we can to make sure that you understand that, and that you are only in the business now of reducing your liability by taking responsible care for these people in the ways that we need to. One last point. I'm sorry to go over just very briefly. Very briefly, DeJong's point about ending homelessness beats managing homelessness. This is a fallacy of false alternatives. I know, just 10 seconds. It's a fallacy of false alternatives. You've got to manage parts of homelessness, even though you don't want to, while you end homelessness.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bruce Pearson, followed by Adrian Lobby.
Hello, everybody. Hello, everybody. My name is Bruce Pearson with the Homeless Action Committee. And how much time do I have?
Same as everyone, 3 minutes.
2 minutes? Okay.
You can watch the little clock in front of you.
Oh, okay. Okay, my feeling is that one-on-one solutions are not really working. We have a block of people there that need what I say is transitional housing. Transitional housing. We have some transitional housing models that seem very feasible, very workable, and no extra liability to the city. I've been working with these people for 1.5 years, and they're in my blood, and I'm in their blood. And what I'd like to do right now is take the rest of my time for a moment of silence to remember this flesh and blood who are down there, who may be thrown back onto wet pavements or cold pavements without cover, without food, as most of you all have food in your refrigerators and a hat over your head, a covering. So the rest of my time is on silence to remember these people who are down there who may be displaced. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Adrian Lobby.
Hi. So we've been down there for 3 weeks now with the Navigation Center and the host team working assiduously with people. As of last Tuesday, there were 15 people who were prepared to go into shelter, who had signed up, got a plan. None of them were in shelter because there was document problems. They didn't have their IDs together. And then there were 5 people that were going to go over to the Palms. So this is not enough. We're not going to get anywhere close to the 90% we saw in the Ian DeJong essay. And I'm not sure why we're not having a public conversation a week before the city police are going to go over there and roust out 100 people or 120 people. It's really surprising to me. I think people would like to know what you all are thinking about that. I want to give you a little heads up. I just sent around our critique of the Ian DeJong essay, which I understand was passed around in the joint meeting of the city and county homelessness task force or whatever that's called. Usually, there's stuff that Ian says that we agree with, and there's stuff he says we don't agree with. And because of the time crunch, because it's a week before the eviction, we spent some time at our meeting this week just what do we don't agree with? And that's what you've got here is what we don't agree with. And the things that are not being done, if you even follow his plan, things are not right. So I urge you to read it. I also want to give you a heads up that Jillian Haley has written a white paper. This is an early draft, but we'll be releasing this soon. And she makes 2 pretty good points. One is that Medicine Hat is often given as the example of the success of Housing First. It's a Canadian city. And they had natural gas reserves, and they were very, very wealthy. So it's not an example of how we can do it here. It's probably a pretty wonderful thing there. The other thing is that she makes the point that harm reduction is the core of Housing First. When it started in Pathways in New York City, it was a harm reduction model. It was a, let's try to help people as best we can, and here's how we're going to do it, getting them into housing first. That has morphed as this philosophy has traveled around the country. And it is no longer about let's reduce harm, it's about let's coerce people into something that we think they should do, and if they don't like it, well, it's probably their fault. So this will be coming out soon, and I wanted to give you a little heads up. I guess I just, you know, I thought of the parade of faces that when Bruce did his 1 minute, and I really would urge you all to go down there, and it would be good if you had an introduction, because it is their home, but go down there and meet 1 or 2 people, and I think it would be a really useful thing. Thank you.
Thank you. Thomas Ells.
Thank you. Imagine yourselves being evicted. The fear for these folks has been palpable for quite some time since those notices went out. There are potential solutions. Mid-Penn offered the hardware store several times regarding to be used as a shelter or to be used as safe camping or safe parking. We'd like to explore that, move them completely off of essentially the county property. It's owned by Mid-Penn. It's not county property. They'd offered it already. KBBF has offered their property. So a combination of those things. We have solutions that are right around the corner. When Ian DeJong talked about his proposals over at Spring Hills, and I was there both days, and he tore Adrian a new one when she talked about harm reduction and what Housing First wasn't, and mentioned the HUDs. So I waited. Later on, I said, I built those HUDs. Not with Harold, but I built those HUDs. And I talked to him and I said, I think what you're saying really is that there's a panoply of solutions, a combination of things that have to be done. And as I spoke, I mean, you know, he ripped everybody. When they spoke up there, no matter who it was, he ripped them a new one. And when I spoke, he said, I got nothing. Not that I had nothing to say, that he had nothing to say. He had nothing to say against what I said, which was that you have to have a panoply of solutions. You can't just come draconianly implementing this thing, because as you can see, it's not as easy as it sounds. It's really not. And not just the changes in operating procedures, and it's not just who is going or how they're going. Now we're having a 50% reduction in the VSPDAT, the people that are most vulnerable, the vulnerability index, that they're not going to use that for 50% of the people now because it's not really working. And the county's not even adopted that yet, so they're not even using the Housing First, but they're going to foist onto you the responsibility of, and potentially liability, for moving these people off of that property consistent with a Housing First model that they're not even adopted, that they haven't even adopted. So I would say, and we're hoping to look at that this action, there's a potential action that we've held back from you folks several times, and that was on purpose, so we could protect you, so you didn't get involved in these things.
Thank you. We're going to have our closed session now. Thanks for coming, everyone.
Thank you.